Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 60 for Sunday the 25th of August 2019. And this week we've got a rather special episode. We're covering the 1980s movie Morant, a little-known movie or story outside of Australia and South Africa. It tells the tale of a group of irregular soldiers that were employed by the British during the Anglo-Boer War at the start of the 20th century. My name is Andrew Blischik, and with me as ever is Martin Darlington. Hello, Martin.
Hello, Andrew. And for an extra special treat this week, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Des Latham, host of the Anglo-Boer War Podcast. He's very kindly agreed to join us and lend us his vast knowledge of the period, the events, and the environment in which this week's movie took place. So, Des, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us, and just please tell people about yourself and your show.
Well, I'm really honored to be here, Andrew and Martin. Thank you so much for approaching me. I mean, the story I started telling 2 years ago was oblique and was unique and obscure. So I was a bit gobsmacked to be approached by you two, and I'm really pleased to be here and talking to you. I know we've chatted a couple of times in the run-up to this and looked at our various podcasts and what we do. And I think there's a real coordination that, as you were mentioning, we're from the three main countries that have or were affected by the Boer War. But in 2017, I went online and I was looking at iTunes for the story because I was fascinated by the fact that many of world leaders were involved. Gandhi was a stretcher bearer, for example. Mahatma Gandhi and Winston Churchill was a war reporter. So starting from there and working backwards to my South African leadership, I thought, well, there must be a podcast of some sort. And then I discovered there wasn't, which shocked me, I must say. So because it's a chronological story. It's a story of a war that takes 3 years almost in the telling, and no one had gone through the period at all. There were a few documentaries, but that's about it. So I started it in October 2017. I'm following the weeks of the war. So the war started in October 1899 and it finished in May 1902. So I'm into year 2 and my podcast series will wrap up next year, May.
Yeah, and I there will be a link to your podcast in the show notes on the episodes page for this episode. And I do have to give a big shout out to Nick Parkinson. He was the first listener of ours who pointed us at your podcast and actually suggested if we could get you on, it would be great. So, Nick, a huge thank you. This would not be happening if it wasn't for you. And I wouldn't have spent hours and hours of absolute fascinated delight listening to Des's podcast. It's brilliant. I love the voices you do. I do. In the early episodes, and this is not me being a touchy Brit, but it did make me chuckle that British senior officers all had quite an effeminate voice, and the Boer commanders all had deep, gruff voices.
But, yes, I am a bit biased at times about that. But also, strange enough, I'd read a lot about their voices. I'd read about, for instance, Cecil John Rhodes had a squeaky voice. So, and it was a matter of much mirth at the time. He'd talk about taking over Africa, and he'd say, "We will be taking over Africa."
Yeah, and following the chronological sequence has been a really good move. But what's amazing is there's no weeks where you said, "Well, nothing really much happened this week." There's always something going on.
Precisely.
And Des, just for benefit of our listeners, can you give the precise name of the podcast? I don't know what to search for.
Thank you. I should have hard sold myself there, sorry. The Anglo-Boer War Podcast, it's called. AB War Podcast for short, and that's the website, abwarpodcast.com. That's it. There's a debate about that, by the way. Some people said it should be called the South African War, because it's not just the Anglos and Boers, the blacks were involved in South Africa. So it's generally known by academics as the South African War, but that's, I thought, does not have the ring to it that everyone kind of recognizes.
And of course, there were multiple wars in South Africa, so that it's not as clear. I think Anglo-Boer War is fine because they were the main antagonists.
Well, shall we get on with the usual business of news and updates, Martin?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll just draw the listeners' attention on some updates. We're about to add some more movies to the planned episodes page, which will take us up to the end of the year. And if anyone feels strongly about any list of proposed movies, please do feel free to support or protest our decisions.
Yeah. Now we've already thanked Nick Parkinson, but it's worth reiterating that without Nick's input, so this show with Des wouldn't have happened. So we're really, really grateful for that, and hopefully that will be encouragement to other people with ideas. Dr. Phil Pomerantz, when we first mentioned Breaker Morant, which would suit our original thought would have suited the under the radar sort of, doing a potted synopsis on 4 or 5 obscure movies. But Nick, Dr. Phil, Gary Shavit, I think, a couple of other listeners all wrote in saying, no, do Breaker Morant, it's a great film. I'd never heard of it till you brought it to my attention, Andrew. I didn't know the story, I didn't know the movie. Nick also, after the last episode where I did the supplementaries, the ones that got away, he said a better film portraying the experience of Japanese or Allied POWs under the Japanese in the last war was The Railway Man with, I think it's Colin Firth. Nick also said, I've recently seen The Red Baron and it's a rubbish TV movie. So, sorry Rob Irwin, I don't think we'll be doing The Red Baron. And he watched The 12th Man after our recommendation, which would be another good one for Under the Radar. I don't know if either of you guys have seen The 12th Man. It's about a Second World War Norwegian commando team sent in by the Brits, and they're betrayed, and there's 12-man team, 11 are killed or captured, and 1 man gets away, and it's an incredible story of survival. He's against the elements, and he's supported by families who pass him from one, isolated farm to the next to get him out and get him across the border to Sweden. Really, really grueling. I haven't looked into how accurate it is, but it is definitely based on a real event and a real story.
Is it English language or Norwegian?
No, it's in English. It's in English language. There's some German with subtitles, and there's they do this thing with this really clever. There's a really nice guy who is a German officer, but he's also an absolutely dedicated Nazi. But he's pleasant to people, well, he's not, because he's hunting these prisoners, and he's had 100% success rate, and he's brutal, but he's quite charming. It's really sinister. It's very, very well done. And just to mention as well, we've also heard from our friend Sean Munger, host of the Second Decade podcast, and we are delighted to report that Sean will be rejoining us very soon.
Excellent news. We have a review. It's been a bit of a drought for reviews, but we've got one now, which is good, and it's entitled Great Little Listen and 5 stars in Apple Podcasts by Arwen Loves History from Australia on the 10th of August 2019. Arwen says, I discovered this podcast some time ago, and I've now listened to all the episodes. It was completely won over with Zulu, a family favourite. Loved the episode with Sean Munger, another favourite podcast. Always pleased when a new episode drops. Highly recommended. 3 exclamation marks. Well, thank you very much, Arwen. That's a great review. Much appreciated.
Yeah, really like that. And we also heard from what's becoming a serial supporter and emailer, Christine Dockstader. And thank you for the pronunciation guide, Christina. She had a few more suggestions. The Dallas Buyers Club and Amistad, both of which we looked at before, and they are on the long list. Hacksaw Ridge, she mentions. Now, initially it was a shoe-in, but we did go through a bit of a boys' war movie binge, so it's on the long to medium list at the moment. And I have read some criticisms of it plays around with history quite a lot. Now, one she did mention that I think we may well drop into the under the radar is Disaster Artist. It's made by the Franco brothers and stars them. It sounds really interesting. It's a movie about the making of a total flop of a movie, The Room, considered by many to be the worst movie ever made, which made me think, have they not seen Titanic 2? Which is hilarious. It's so bad.
Or Plan B from Outer Space.
Exactly. So we'll take a closer look at The Disaster Artist, but it scores, I think it's over 90% on Rotten Tomatoes from both critics and audiences, or I think it's 91 from critics and 86 from audiences. Now, also, I heard from my sister Susanna. Hello, Susanna. She and her husband and mother-in-law watched Operation Finale, the movie released late last year starring Ben Kingsley as Adolf Eichmann, showing his abduction from Argentina by an Israeli snatch team so he could go on trial in Israel for his war crimes. Now, Susanna's husband Yakov and his mother are Jewish, and Angela, and they really liked the movie, and they were unable to understand the negative reviews, so we may well revisit that. And see if maybe it's because I think it's in the 60s, both from critics and audiences, but not that many reviews were done, so maybe we'll look back at that one. In the Kingdom of Heaven episode, Andrew, you read out a message we'd received from a friend of yours and a listener, Rosie. You then forwarded me a message from Rosie's son, Ross, which I was meant to read out in the intro to the Supplementary 4 episode, and I forgot. I am so sorry. So here is Andrew with a fascinating and really touching email from Ross.
Yes, the email reads, "Hi Andrew, I've just today finished listening to and thoroughly enjoying an episode of your podcast. Mum reminded me of your podcast recently after we had discussed it back in Cover in 2017. It's taken me a while to actually have a listen. Anyway, I just want to let you know that I really enjoyed it. It was the Gallipoli episode. This one jumped out at me when I was in the Gallipoli Peninsula in my gap year around the year 2000. Listening to the show brought back memories of walking over the hills and dunes and picking old rusted bullets and bits of shell cartridges out of the sand, and the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, thinking that these are the very same bullets that were being fired at young men by other young men at this very spot. I reflected on the power of this story and the Anzac myth in Australian culture. That 3 19-year-old boys from Melbourne, myself and 2 friends, fresh out of high school and having learned about the Gallipoli campaign at our history classes, decided to travel to this far-off peninsula nearly 100 years after the event. I think it was particularly relevant for us that we could relate with the stories of these young men, many of them similar age or younger than we were at the time, and could not fathom that while it felt like our young lives were just beginning and our freedom and independence opening up, those young men were voluntarily giving up their freedom and laying down their lives at this very place. I'm really impressed with the level of research that you and Martin put into the show, and I also love the format and the flow of the show, very professional production values. Thanks for sharing your love of history and cinema. I look forward to listening to more episodes. Ross." Well, as you say, that's a great email. Lovely.
Oh, it's fantastic. And to have actually been to Gallipoli and experienced, the ground and, like you said, finding old bits of, cartridge cases and bullets and, wow, chilling. Really, really good.
Personalises it, yeah.
So now we'll get on with the show, and we're just going to feed in with a little bit of music, which is actually taken from the movie. And for those of you who are familiar with Des's podcast, it's the same tune that you use in your intro, your theme music, Des. Now, I've in my notes called it Der Alte Transvaal, because I know Dutch is quite similar to German, but I can't quite make out what the title is. But is it something like that?
It's actually Sari Marais, which is the name of a woman. And the tune comes from a American Civil War tune called The Morning Dew. So although I've spoken to some American academics about this, and they say they're not fully aware of that song, but that's basically the history of that tune. And by the way, it's used by the Royal Marines as one of the marching songs.
Well, I never knew that.
That's fascinating.
There we go. And now, on with the show.
Brang mij terug naar die old Transvaal, daar waar mijn Sarre voer. Daaronder in de middels bij de groen door een boom, daar woont mijn Sari Marais. Daaronder in de middels bij de groen door een boom, daar woont mijn Sari Marais.
So, as always, let's start with the story of the movie. Breaker Morant was released in 1980. It starred British veteran actor Edward Woodward in the eponymous role, ably supported by Australian actors Bryan and Jack Thompson. It was directed by Australian director Bruce Beresford, who also co-wrote the screenplay based on a 1978 play by the same name, which was written by Kenneth G. Ross. Beresford would go on to direct Driving Miss Daisy in 1989, which would win the Best Picture Oscar. However, he himself wasn't nominated for Best Director, which caused Billy Crystal to make the quip about Driving Miss Daisy. It's the movie that directed itself.
Yeah. Beresford has been accused by some critics, probably British critics of creating an anti-British movie to reflect his Republican political beliefs and turning 3 war criminals into folk heroes. His response has been quoted as denying his movie ever tried to cast doubt on the guilt of the 3 accused men, but he wanted to show how war could lead to atrocities being committed by people who gave every appearance of being quite normal. And he says he's amazed that people could interpret his film as being poor downtrodden Australians being framed by Brits.
Rotten Tomatoes gives the critics rating a very favourable, of course, 100%, and a rare distinction, and the audiences in turn rated it a very high 91% positive. Box office takings are only available from Australia, where it took 4.7 million Australian dollars, which roughly equates to over 400 million Australian dollars in today's money.
Sorry, that's 20 million. That's my typo.
Sorry, that's a typo.
The 4 should have been a dollar sign.
Got it. So the 4.7 million back in the day, 1980s, would be worth about $20 million in today's money. That's pretty good going, making 4.7 million from an initial budget of only $500,000 Australian dollars. But the director, Bruce Beresford, says it was more a critical success than a financial one.
Yeah, it was filmed around the town of Burra in South Australia. It manages not to look like a low-budget effort, largely thanks to the convincing performances of the leading actors. And after its release, a movement began in Australia that still continues seeking pardons for the 3 defendants. So far, this has been unsuccessful, but more of that in our conclusion at the end of the synopsis and reality check. And now, on with the synopsis and reality check of the movie itself. So the movie opens with text on the screen giving us a summary of the Boer War between the British Empire and the Dutch Boer farmers in South Africa who were seeking their independence from British rule. By 1901, the British had occupied most of the Boer territory but were having difficulty with the effective guerrilla tactics of the Boer soldiers. As far as the main characters go, Breaker Morant had been born in the UK. He was born in Somerset or Devon. His mother ran a workhouse for boys, and he was given he was a very bright lad. He was given a scholarship to a grammar school, what we in Britain now today would call a public school, but most other countries it's the other way around. It would be a private school. So he got good education. He developed the accent and the airs and manners of a gentleman, even though he actually wasn't. But he would claim to be the estranged son of a Admiral Morant. His name when he was born was actually M.U. Morant, not Morant, as it became later. So he was a little bit loose and free with his background. Moved to Australia when he was 19, and he got the name Breaker from breaking horses, at which he was phenomenally good. There was one story I read about him where there was a horse that was famously unrideable, and it almost like a bucking bronco thing, and people would take bets, how long can this guy stay on board? And he broke the horse. He stayed on board. He never got thrown off after a prolonged fight with it. He was also a bit of a bush poet. And now, this is not a name that I was familiar with, but I'm sure Andrew can tell us about Banjo Patterson, who I believe was a contemporary and a friend of Breaker's.
Yeah, that's right. He was a war correspondent to the Boer War. He wrote for, I think, one of the Sydney Morning Herald. He's one of around about this time when Australia got independence from Britain in 1901, it had a great swell of nationalism. And so we were celebrating all things Australian, but particularly that rural aspect, that rural idyll of the noble life lived on the land. And there were lots of bush poets writing about farming and noble pursuits in the outdoors, even though we were even then a very urbanised nation. And but Banjo Patterson is very famous in this country. He's most famous, I guess, for having written the words for our folk song Waltzing Matilda.
Yeah, which a lot of British people think is your national anthem.
No. It should be perhaps, but it's extremely well known.
And I mean, as Des has already referred to, there are some incredible characters were present during this war. Winston Churchill was there as a war correspondent, and I can't help picturing Boris Johnson when I can imagine him being a bit of a sort of, oh, let's go and have a go at this. It sounds like tremendous fun. And he was almost a combatant, wasn't he? And he escaped from a prisoner of war camp and all sorts. Mahatma Gandhi founded an ambulance corps. He was there as a stretcher bearer. and he organised a group of his fellow Indians into an ambulance corps. And Des, am I right in saying he was part of the evacuation of the wounded from Spion Kop?
He was involved in Colenso.
Colenso, right.
That's correct. And he was involved in Spion Kop indirectly, but mainly Colenso. And the amazing fact about that is that years later, he and Churchill had a relationship until the drive to independence in India, and then Churchill disliked him intensely for a number of reasons. One is that Gandhi won a number of medals, more than a dozen medals for courage in the Anglo-Boer War, and he actually gave them back to the British just before the national independence of India, and that really upset Churchill. But in initial discussions, they figured out that on one of the mountainsides of Colenso, during the battle, they actually walked past each other.
Wow.
But they only figured that out many, many years later, which I thought was a strange statement about kind of an odd moment in history.
For sure. The image we all have of Mahatma Gandhi is, a robe-wearing, sandal, ascetic, spiritual leader, but he was a tough little cookie. He went and saving people's lives under fire is pretty much the pinnacle of our modern idea of heroism, I think. We also had Arthur Conan Doyle, who was a doctor there, the author of the Sherlock Holmes books. Rudyard Kipling, another famous English poet and author, visited South Africa very often and spent time with some of the others. And the way that war entered the consciousness, and I'm not sure how many, particularly British soccer fans, football fans, are aware, but all the grounds that have a Kop with the "you'll never take the Kop," because obviously tribalism in football is well recognised, and it has always had an element of at least threatened violence. And the opposing fans will never take our Kop, and that comes from Spion Kop. So it wasn't Liverpool who came up with it first. All the regiments that were represented there came back saying, "Wow, we just couldn't take it," and so they christened their home stands, where the hardcore fans would stand, the Kop. So I think you've got them in Sheffield and Leeds and a few other places.
And is Kop Afrikaans word for hill or something?
It's for the top of a hill.
Top of a hill, right.
So it means, the Spion Kop would mean the spy's lookout in direct translation.
Right.
And it also is quite symbolic in the area and the fighting, because you could see both into the Transvaal and into Natal from there. So it was like at the cusp of the two different, one a republic, the other a colony. And it was, that's one of the reasons why it was bitterly fought over.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great summary of setting the scene for the war, so thanks, guys. If we go back to the movie now, we've got the first scene, and we see a military band playing a jolly song in Petersburg on the Transvaal, South Africa, and it's November 1901. And outside Petersburg, we see the British military camp with soldiers in kilts marching up and down, and local labourers helping to run the camp. Inside the camp, we see two tables of 6 officers facing each other, and we learn that it's the closing of an inquiry into the behaviour of 3 lieutenants: Harry Breaker Morant, Edward Woodward, Peter Hancock, played by Bryan, and George Whidden, played by Lewis Fitzgerald. We see Morant stand and address the inquirers. He gives us the story of his recent history, enlisting in South Australia, rapid promotion, and then leave in England to fix some family business. He then tells us he came back to the action in South Africa, where he seems to distinguish himself in several battles. He then volunteered to join the Bushveld Carbineers in the Transvaal. There he captured a Boer commander and was recognised for DSO. What's that stand for, Martin?
Distinguished Service Order.
Breaker then tells the Inquisitors that he takes full responsibility for the events at Fort Edward, where he was always acting under orders and was deeply disturbed by what happened to one Captain Hunt. The movie then cuts back to Fort Edwards, where we see this Captain Hunt, played by Terence Donovan, at night with his men, and they're approaching a Boer farmhouse. The farmhouse seems empty, or at least lightly guarded. Their information has come from a black African informant, and Hunt questions this informant and gets his local translator to confirm that this is the right place to trap these Boer rebels. The informant confirms that this is the place to catch some Boers on the run. Hunt then orders his men to approach, and there's about 15 of his men near the farmhouse. All hell breaks loose. There are Boers lying in wait. They're appearing from everywhere, from within the house, from under the adjacent wagon, and from every possible hiding place, shooting and massacring Hunt's men. In a chaotic retreat, the massacre continues, and Hunt himself is wounded. But his men don't return to get him. They pretty much abandon him to the mercy of the Boers. So Hunt's been chiefly abandoned by his Sergeant Major, one Drummond, played by Australian actor Ray Meagher. Now, I think we need to unpack some of that. Lots happened. We've got Morant introducing himself and how he got to South Africa, and then we've got this terrible ambush of Hunt's men. Any thoughts on that, Des?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things. First of all, there were not a lot of killed on both sides. It was, I think, 6. There were 3 members of Hunt's unit that were killed, including the black assistant from the local Lobedu people. And there were 3 Boers killed, including the 2 farmers, the farmer and his brother who ran the farm, the Viljoen farm, it was known, at the top of this quite difficult to approach mountain, kind of airy. They placed the farmhouse on the top, and there were actually stairs hewn out of the rocks to climb up to get to it. So it was really difficult. It was nighttime attack. So that's just the first thing just to put on the record, is that it wasn't as violent. Well, it was violent, but it was a little skirmish compared to the battles that had been going on.
And there were some players missing out there. There were more people than we would think from the movie actually present for this attack.
There were 400 members of Captain Hunt's unit involved, so it's a significantly large unit. And there were about a dozen Boers. As usual, the Boers, had very small units. There were only about 60,000 in total fighting at this point, and even that is presumed to be an exaggeration, probably closer to 30,000 in total across the whole of the 2 major territories that were still, undergoing warfare. So it was a significantly large unit that he headed up. And the majority of those members, by the way, were black soldiers. The Lobedu people, who were kind of warlike, had offered their men to the British to use, and they did.
Yeah, and the bit about Breaker introducing himself, Breaker Morant, it's worth pointing out that when he went across to South Africa, he was with a regular Australian unit, and he was a private soldier. He was quickly promoted to corporal. I think he might have made sergeant, and it was his his engagement period finished. He completed his tour, and rather than go back, he wanted to stay. And by then, I think he'd become friends with Captain Hunt, or Lieutenant Hunt as he was initially. And he was invited to join the Bushveld Carbineers, and he was commissioned at that stage, so he became a lieutenant. But he was at least in his 40s, I think, at this stage. So he wasn't a young man. One of the accounts, we've read various sources. I read the final Breaker Morant, the final roundup by Roger Roper and I think Joe West, and they were saying that part of the reason he wanted to stay is there was an awful lot of profits being made by some of these independent irregular units, where they basically they'd confiscate Boer cattle and sheep, and then they'd sell them for personal profit, which is, I think a blind eye was turned to it. So part of his reason to stay would have been, well, I'm making a lot more money here than I was in Australia breaking horses, and that's a young man's game, and I'm not young anymore. Yeah,
and you're right, Morant had been accused of actually taking Boer cattle and selling it for his own profit.
I think most of them were accused of that at some stage. It seems to have been pretty wholesale.
The Carbineers built up a name around almost banditry, you would call it, looting, I think we would call it. And they were not well liked by the British or by the Boers for that reason.
Yeah, no.
The attack was real. It's a bit different in reality. It was a moonlit night, as I think they show in the movie, and they show them descending down onto the farmhouse. But you're saying they would have ascended up towards it as it was on the top of the ridge. But there is a fair bit of truth in that scene, I guess. They simplified it right down to a couple of dozen protagonists rather than hundreds, as you suggested.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the point is that Captain Hunt was told by 3 different people not to attack the farmhouse, including a soldier called Shield, who had actually switched sides from the Boers. And he said one of the worst things to do is attack a high ground at night with a bright moon when you don't know, you have no intelligence about what's inside. And of course, if you've done any military training at all, those are the three of the main rules that you have at nighttime. You try not to attack upwards unless it's really dark and you know exactly where you're going, and you know exactly what you're going to get. Or else you're just asking for what they received, which was a surprise.
Yeah, it's something that again in the book I read and some of the other accounts I've read in articles say it's kind of, he was an experienced officer, he was an experienced soldier. They can't really understand what the rush was, why he didn't wait for dawn, and the suggestion that the Boers would have probably surrendered because of the numbers against them. But yeah, he decided, no, I'm just going to push straight in. Then of course he's hit, and the unit pulled back under his second in command, whoever that was. Morant wasn't there. No. And this is where his body is abandoned, and this whole key thing about this mutilation goes on. Now, some accounts seem to suggest that he wasn't mutilated at all, and what they saw and interpreted as him having been kicked to death by the Boers is actually the lividity. You know, any part of a dead body in contact with the ground the blood will pool there, and it can look like severe bruising. I'm not sure, but Des, you feel that if he was, it was probably a local Nyanga or Sangoma witch doctor or something?
That's right. That's correct. I mean, as you say, there's some dispute about this, but there was some mutilation, and we're not told in detail what it was, and the research I've done indicates there was some kind of mutilation, but on both the Boers and the British who were lying there. And the black soldier who was shot with him, by the way. So, and it's presumed that the Nyanga or the Sangoma had arrived under cover of darkness and quickly picked off a couple of choice parts and, disappeared. And then it gained, and that story then escalated when you don't have proper information, you always believe the worst things, as we all know.
You believe anything that reinforces your own existing prejudices, I guess.
Pretty much.
And I think it's not quite true to say that he was just abandoned by his men on the spot. There was some attempt to go back and retrieve his wounded body or his deceased body, wasn't there?
There was, and also one of the ironies is both sides retreated. So there was, because of the chaos of war, the gunshots gone off, it was a few minutes of exchange, the leader went down. Inside the farmhouse, two of the main Boer commanders went down as well. So the survivors kind of retreated, which also makes sense if you think about it. But neither side was aware of that.
Okay, well maybe we'll go back to the action in the movie after the terrible events at the farmhouse. We see that it's the next day, and at Fort Edwards we see Hancock and Whitten watch Hunt's remaining men straggle back to the camp. This gets Morant's attention, and he watches this sorry bunch return, and he sees that Hunt's horse is empty. Morant listens to their stories of the ambush and the massacre, including the shooting of Hunt. Drummond is adamant that there's nothing they could have done to prevent the bloodbath. Hancock accuses their local white guide of tricking Hunt into this trap, saying that he's like a spy for the Boers. But we know that he's the only one that even mentioned rescuing Hunt. Morant then chews out their intelligence officer, one Captain Taylor, played by John Waters, as clearly the intelligence information that he provided was severely lacking. Taylor's only defence is to tell Morant to go and revenge Captain Hunt.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a little bit of conflating of locations, isn't there? Because they actually went back to the mission station from where they'd staged the attack, not Fort Edward. And Morant shown as present in the film. There's a bit of conflation of time. You can understand that for the narrative.
But we have met Taylor for the first time, and he's a bit of a villain, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yes, his nickname was Bulala, which means kill.
That says it all.
And he ended up in Rhodesia after the war as a Native Affairs Commissioner, and he was known as pretty hardcore when it came to treating black Rhodesians. And he was used as one of the examples of later during the Bush War in Rhodesia. He was kind of escalated in the minds of many of those who fought as the example of what you should do with black people. I can't say much more, but the point is that he and Morant then got confused. I think Morant got confused, or appears to become confused, or wanted to become confused about what Taylor And what Hunt had told Taylor was Taylor then apparently discussed with Morant that there was now a rule about prisoners.
More of that later.
Which should not be taken. Sure, but they were at their Medigan mission, it was called, run by the German Missionary Society. And the Germans were in a kind of a difficult situation because many of their members in the mission supported the Boers, but the priest, the reverend, his name was Reuter, didn't. And it was his message to Hunt that got Hunt involved in the first place. And he was one of those who warned Hunt not to attack during the night, just out of interest.
And Taylor's, he's referred to as Captain Taylor, and yet one of the accusations of the whole against the British is, they've court-martialed 3 Australian officers and let the British one go. And Taylor was born in Ireland and actually lived in Rhodesia most of his life, but he was an intelligence officer. And even though he had the rank of captain, he was a former military officer. There was, after the incident came to light, there was a decision made that actually he didn't come under military authority, so he'd have to be tried by the civil courts, which never happened. He had a strange position, and you see in the film and certainly accounts of whenever he was told, held accountable, he'd say, well, I had no command. I was an advisor. I was just the intelligence officer. I'd give them advice, but no, it wasn't my place to command people. So yeah, bit of a strange. He's not in the chain of command, but he obviously was quite a strong character. A slippery intelligence officer, I think, Des, you've described him as, which pretty much sums him up. And known to be a spy for Kitchener's headquarters.
Okay, well, let's get back to the movie. We're back in the original timeline where our 3 lieutenants are under inquisition. They're led before a Lieutenant Colonel Denny, played by Bud Tingwell, and they learn the results of the inquiry we've just seen. It's not good. Turns out they're going to undergo a full court-martial and remain in prison until then. Hancock and Morant stoically accept this news, while the younger Lieutenant Whitten looks at them, clearly worried where this is all going. Then the action moves to Lord Kitchener's office in Pretoria. We see Major Charles Bolton, played by Australian actor Rod Mulliner. He arrives and we see Lord Kitchener and Colonel Hamilton briefing him. They ask Bolton if he's heard of the Bushveld Carbineers. Turns out that he has, a very effective unit against the Boers, made up principally of volunteers from Britain's colonies, no doubt including our 3 accused lieutenants. Bolton then learns that he will be the Army's prosecutor for this upcoming court-martial against the 3, and they're going to be accused of murdering Boer prisoners and a German missionary. Kitchener then tells Bolton that all the eyes of Europe will be on this trial. The German government and their Kaiser, who is Queen Victoria's grandson, are particularly interested due to the death of the German minister. And the Germans, we learn, are looking for an excuse to enter the war on the side of the Boers. So it's not looking good for our 3 accused lieutenants. And it's likely to get worse, as they will be defended by a New South Wales rural lawyer, one Major Thomas.
I was going to say, should we just wrap that bit up there? Yeah, because Morant and the others were arrested as thieves when they originally arrived in Petersburg, didn't they? And then they were clapped in irons and secured. They weren't the only arrests. There was a Lieutenant Picton and a Major Lenihan, who was the commander of the Bushveld Carbineers, or this company of the Bushveld Carbineers, although he wasn't present for most of the incidents, but he did have forward knowledge of it, and we'll come to them when we get to the summary at the end, I guess. Kitchener, the matter of the minister, Heese, the Kaiser and the German government applying pressure, that's a fictional addition. The Germans were aware of the case, but Reverend Heese was a naturalised British subject, so the Germans have said, well, it's nothing to do with us. Just a little interesting aside, Colonel Hamilton, who was much mentioned in the early episodes of Des's podcast, and during the war, the Boer War, got promoted all the way up to Lieutenant General. He's the same Hamilton who commanded the landings at Gallipoli in a previous episode of ours, and he continued his indecisive traits, first displayed in South Africa when he stayed on board a warship rather than actually land with his troops at Gallipoli and get a feel for the real conditions, because he was mentioned quite a lot in your early parts of your podcast, wasn't he, Des?
Yeah, that's right. He made some significant errors in the Natal campaign during the Boer War, and his nickname was Johnny Hamilton. And I've actually got a book here, a biography about him, which I've been reading. It's quite interesting. the part he played in the First World War. But he was renowned for making decisions that were not well thought through.
Yeah.
And perhaps Gallipoli was another. Well, not that he thought Gallipoli through, but he was just part of the team that decided to land there. But the point being made that he was famous for hesitating.
Yeah, and that comes out again and again. But interesting, yeah. He was very well thought of by Kitchener, who seems to have viewed him as something of or Kitchener was his mentor and sort of kind of led him by the nose through his career.
Kitchener had a group around him called the Kitchener's Boys. They came out of Khartoum, the Sudan. And
Right.
Hamilton, not necessarily directly related to that conflict, but only a couple of years before, he had managed to succeed in taking Khartoum, and he was known as Kitchener of Khartoum. And he had a group of men, officers around him called Kitchener's Boys, and Hamilton was one of those.
Kitchener's an important historical figure. I know a little bit about him, but could we spend maybe just a couple of sentences on who he was, particularly in the context of the movie?
Well, I mean, he was the commander-in-chief of the forces in South Africa. He'd taken over from Lord Roberts. Roberts had an idea that he would march straight up from the Cape Town through the center of South Africa, take the main cities, and then, like European conflicts, they would surrender. He'd completely miscalculated the fact that the Boers were African, that they would then break them into small units and keep fighting. He had no idea that was going to happen. Then Kitchener took over from Roberts when he was seconded back to Britain, and he had started the concentration camps, for example, and setting up things like the blockhouses. Then Kitchener really tightened his grip and became the firm controller of the conflict thereafter. So he was the commander-in-chief. He was also highly respected by his men, because he would get up at 5 a.m. and start working out and ride horses and then have his breakfast. And he was kind of part of the group. He never alienated himself from what was going on. So I think he was quite highly respected at the time.
Fair enough.
Okay, so back to the movie. In the next scene, we see Morant, Hancock and Whitten being led into prison. Whitten laments how did he get here. He's been arrested instead of winning a Victoria Cross. Then we meet their lawyer, Major J.F. Thomas. He arrives and introduces himself to the men. They start to get to know each other, and it turns out Thomas has only received the inquiry findings yesterday, just 2 days before tomorrow's trial. And Thomas has previously done 0 court-martials, and as an Australian country solicitor has little to no trial experience. Our 3 lieutenants seem very unimpressed with their lawyer. That night, at the Lieutenant Colonel's house, Denny's house, there's a dinner with the officers and some local ladies. The prosecutor we met before in Kitchener's office, Major Bolton, is also there when Thomas arrives. One of the British officers asks if is it true that Morant was a successful poet in Australia, something that Thomas confirms. The British officers present are quite amused by this. They also want to know why his name is Breaker, and Thomas explains he's a very accomplished horseman, as Martin's already told us, and he could break in the toughest of colts. The group are then serenaded by a Boer baritone who sings to them in Dutch. The Dutch-speaking...
And that's the song we heard on the feed into this section.
And the Dutch-speaking local ladies seem moved by his song. The next morning, as Thomas and the prisoners are led to court, Thomas, the lawyer, is desperately trying to clarify some facts to help his barely formed arguments. Thomas is a little rattled and he drops his notes, and he leaves our prisoners to think that they're in the hands of a bumbling idiot. Now, did you have any reaction to that Dutch song? What's the significance of what the guy's singing? Is there any symbolic there that we need to know as non-Dutch speakers?
Yes, it's probably the most famous Republican song that at the time was being sung. So it's a bit like singing your enemy's song straight to your face, which is the most important song that they sing. I can't think immediately offhand about examples that make sense, but you can understand how the Boer woman there and the singer were basically saying, we're not going to stop, we're going to keep fighting, straight to the officers who probably wouldn't understand the words. And the words are very much around what I've just said.
Yeah.
It's about a woman, and I'll get back to you once we finish fighting and we're victorious. We'll get back to you, the woman. And so that's why
really
the woman
saying sort of up yours to the British in front of them, and they don't even know that they're being insulted or defended. Okay. Precisely.
Well, I'm sure one or two could understand Afrikaans or Dutch Afrikaans, which was being spoken at the time. But the point being that that's quite a symbolic moment.
That's a great scene if you understand what's going on there.
In the reality of that scene, yeah, J.F. Thomas was their lawyer, although the timing does go a bit out of sync, because the court-martial didn't happen until early 1902. And in fact, Thomas was only given 1 day to confer with the prisoners before the trial, wasn't he? And Major Bolton wasn't the prosecution lawyer for all 3 charges. He got in because there was 2 separate charges of different incidents killing Boer prisoners, and then there was the one with Reverend Heeser. But you've read a biography of J.F. Thomas, I believe, Andrew.
Yeah, there's a relatively hot off the press biography of Thomas by Australian journalist Greg Groden that I had a good go at last week or two. And Thomas was much more accomplished than they suggest. It's this bumbling lawyer that we've just met. He was already a very successful country lawyer in Tenterfield, a town in northern New South Wales. In addition to dealing with the locals' wills and property law, he had in fact defended clients against criminal charges, so he wasn't quite as inexperienced as they suggest. He was also a published poet, a successful journalist, and he also ran one of the 2 newspapers in Tenterfield, so he was a successful newspaperman. And this, where we're meeting him here, it's the end of his second tour of duty in South Africa, but he was seen as damaged goods by Kitchener and the other senior leaders. He'd been severely reprimanded by the British command for his actions at a place called Renoster Kop, where a Boer ambush saw men under his command that were injured. And instead of immediately retaliating against the Boers, Thomas first tended to some of his wounded men, and that's what got him into trouble with Kitchener, that believed he should have gone on the counter-attack immediately. At the end of that tour of duty, he came back to New South Wales and he missed all the excitement of the front in South Africa, and he whipped together some more New South Welsh volunteers and he took them back to fight for the British Empire back in South Africa. By this stage, the British command didn't have much respect for him, and they wouldn't let him lead these men that he brought from South Africa. So he was actually feeling lost and very unwanted in South Africa. The second tour of duty was nowhere near a success like the first, and he was about to head home to Australia when he got a letter from one of the original 5 accused, Lenihan, and saying he knew of him and knew that he was in South Africa. And Lenihan asked if he'd come to their defence. And Thomas immediately leapt at this chance to finally do something useful after a year or 2 on his second tour of duty.
Now, I guess we've got a little bit of as we discussed earlier, about different perspectives, as the account I read of the Breaker Morant incident mentioned this action that Major Thomas had been involved in, and said that whilst his men were under fire, he hid under a wagon and later used the excuse that he was treating a wounded man. So, 2 interpretations. I do know that he almost bankrupted himself trying to get these volunteers back across to South Africa for his second tour. And I believe he was also very keen to set up a fund to support the families of Australian soldiers who were killed or wounded. So he was something of a philanthropist, definitely, but just not very successful at it.
No, not second time around. And the events of the trial would go on to haunt him for the rest of his life, but maybe we'll get to that later.
Okay, so we're now in court, and the prisoners file in before the 5 officers who are going to judge them. As soon as the trial starts, Thomas objects and seeks an adjournment due to his lack of preparation, but unsurprisingly he's unsuccessful. He then tries to get the trial dismissed as unconstitutional, and again he's unsuccessful, and none of this really impresses Morant, who sort of gives this impression. And I mean, Edward Woodward, for those who aren't familiar with him, he's a brilliant actor, really, really impressive guy, much underused in my opinion outside British television certainly, and he does a very good job of, I think you get the impression he wants to say his piece. He doesn't want to hide behind, I mean, at one point in the book it suggests that he was advised to plead insanity, temporary insanity. But anyway, the Lieutenant Colonel reads out the charge against the men, killing several Boer prisoners and also the murder of the German missionary Heeser. The prisoners all plead not guilty to all charges. The prosecution's first witness is a civilian, Donald Robertson, who used to command the Carbineers. He says they're an ill-disciplined rabble, especially the Australians, and the unrelated bad-mouthing the Carbineers continues despite Thomas's repeated objections. Hancock is singled out for poor behaviour. He's used Boer prisoners as a human shield in open rail wagons to protect the trains, Under cross-examination, Robertson admits that the Carbineers were very effective in their job, using the Boers' own guerrilla tactics against them. And Thomas asks him if the use of prisoners as human shields continued after Hancock left. The answer is yes, because it was very effective. Thomas also wants to know what Robertson did with Boer prisoners when he was in charge, and was there a policy to shoot them? It's a dangerous line of question that the prosecution and the judges very quickly shut down. But for the first time, we get a little hope that this Major Thomas fellow might be a bit cleverer than he first appeared.
Do we want to talk about that?
So just to wrap that up, yeah.
Well, I mean, there are a number of things I can jump in there. I mean, first of all, the if you look at the details of the shootings, which we've kind of glossed over a little, they were, even by standards of warfare, kind of horrendous. The Hancock story in particular, where the circumstantial evidence rather, shows that he followed Hesse and his black driver, as Hesse was going to inform on the Petersburg authorities, so the British there, that there was summary execution going on. And there's strong suggestion that he was personally involved in shooting the Reverend and the black driver about 15 miles outside Petersburg as he rode from Fort Edward to report. The second was the shooting of Visser, where he was taken prisoner after the Viljoen farm attack. Eventually, Morant was involved in following up that attack, and he opened fire too soon and wounded Visser, or one of his men did. The rest got away, and then by the next day, it had this wounded Boer basically dragged to the top of a little hill because he couldn't walk because he was shot through the ankles, and then summarily shot, and then he didn't die, so they had to execute him with 2 shots on the head. Which, I mean, if you look at the details, which you glossed over a little, I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun here, but I think that it's important to mention that it was quite shocking to the court, the details that they were hearing.
Yeah, and I do think something we'll come back to again and again, but something that as a former soldier, and Des, you served in your military as well, there's a very, very clear distinction between taking no prisoners and what Breaker, Morant and Hancock did, which was capture people and then execute them. Taking no prisoners, refusing to accept a surrender in the heat of battle, during the action. A guy throws his hands up, you ignore that, you shoot him, you bayonet him or whatever. And this has happened since time immemorial. Take no prisoners, give no quarter. A standard of siege warfare when you finally break in after weeks or months of a siege, and the city, the town that you're taking, under the unwritten rules of warfare, would be sacked, and there'd be all sorts of mayhem. And this happened right up to the modern era. But what they did was very, very different. They did take prisoners, and then they murdered them, or they executed them, or they shot them. The thing about the Visser which hit me, and it's not mentioned in this interpretation, but I think they had an 8-man firing squad, or was it 12-man firing squad, and he was only wounded. That implies to me that most, if not nearly all, of that firing squad deliberately missed. 12 bullets, 303, that's a third of an inch in caliber. That is a heavy, heavy bullet. Hit 12 of them hitting you, and it shouldn't have missed from 10 or 15 yards. They did, except maybe 1 or 2 of them, so he's only wounded. And that tells me that these soldiers did not want to do what they were being ordered to do.
Yeah, these soldiers were almost special forces. They were famous for not missing. So, and they'd been on the veldt for some time. They were really crack in many ways, even though they were seen as kind of nasty later. They were really, really good soldiers. They wouldn't have missed from 15 yards, 20 yards away. No,
and this also, I mean, and we'll mention later on, there was even more sinister suspicions of some killings of their own men who protested these things. The other thing about the Carbineers' discipline, Lieutenant Picton had an experience. He tried to discipline some of these soldiers who'd plundered their own supply wagons to get rum so they could get drunk, and they threatened to shoot him.
Yes.
When he tried to discipline them.
That was Picton, I think. Picton was involved in that, and he had lost control of his unit. They were escorting this convoy, and they helped themselves to product. And then when they were caught, they did exactly that. They threatened to shoot him. And that's part of the reason why Hunt ended up at the unit, was because he was sent there with Morant and the others to tighten up discipline.
Yeah, and clearly something that they were partially successful at. Going back to the movie, the next witness is Sergeant Major Drummond, Hunt's second in command, who in the movie we're shown, he's the guy who refused to go back and attempt to rescue of the wounded or dead Hunt. And I believe the body's bullet hole was through the chest, so he probably was killed instantly, in reality that is.
Yeah.
So we learned that immediately on Drummond's return to Fort Edward, Morant insisted that the men return to see what had become of Hunt and the other wounded men. We jump back to that timeline and we see them ride up to a wagon where the stripped dead bodies, including the corpse of Hunt. Morant looks absolutely horrified and furious. He wants revenge against the Boers and says they should go on the hunt despite the Boers having a 2-day head start. And they go off, and after a couple of days they find the Boers, ride down and attack the camp. Some of the Boers are shot in the attack, but most ride away. But then they find a wounded Boer, and this is the character that Des has just been telling us about, Visser, he was wounded in the legs and he couldn't run. And he's accused of wearing Captain Hunt's uniform, and Morant beats him till he confesses to Hunt's murder, or to try and get him to confess to Hunt's murder. And in his rage, he says, right, form a firing squad and shoot him. The Sergeant Major mutters they should take him back to Fort Edwards. Lieutenant Whitten tries to calm Morant down, but it doesn't work. Morant announces that Hunt had 2 relatively minor bullet wounds but died later from mutilations and torture at knife point. So the men rouse themselves to shoot the poor chap there and then. Back to the courtroom timeline, and Thomas points out to Drummond that Lord Kitchener had ordered Boers in khaki were to be shot on sight. In other words, they were in British uniforms as saboteurs and spies and the like. Drummond confirms that he knew this, as Lieutenant Colonel Denny clarifies that this was to occur only when the Boers were in khakis and with an intent to attack. It turns out that this key piece of information was unknown to Morant until that moment in the courtroom. Thomas's cross-examination continues, and Drummond reluctantly admits that discipline and behaviour improved under the Breaker and Hancock's watch. On his way out, Hancock threatens to have a fight with him. Hancock just does not behave like an officer. Who on earth decided to commission this guy? In reality, I'm talking here, he was a blacksmith, he was a farrier with a cavalry unit, unquestioning follower of orders, so probably quite an effective soldier if he was kept on a tight rein. But he's arguing with this guy like a football hooligan in a pub, and he's saying, "I'll bloody have you if you come back." And obviously there was no love lost between Hancock and Drummond.
Key scene.
So we've dealt with Visser, but the truth is he wasn't wearing Hunt's uniform, was he?
No, he had an old pair of British Army trousers that they found. He wasn't wearing it. They found it on his goods when they took him prisoner. And of course, by that stage, most of the Boers were wearing British khaki of some sort because they had no more material left. They had no supplies. So, and also to say that the British were also wearing the Boers hats. Everyone was wearing these large slouch hats that the Boers arrived in. The Australians got their own version of it, and the British were wearing them too. So from a distance, often in these fights, they didn't know who was who because they were wearing the same kind of khaki uniforms. The felt is very brown in winter, and you wear brown, and that's that. So both sides were wearing the same colours. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Morant didn't actually see Hunt's body. That is a dramatical recreation. Hunt had been buried by the time Morant literally heard about it. So that was the second thing that I think must be said about that. And the third about Hancock himself. He'd shot under orders, but he happily shot a Boer who'd turned to fight for the Bushveld Carbineers, a guy by the name of Van Buren. He disapproved of Vissers. He disapproved of an earlier shooting of 6 Afrikaner men and boys in Valdezia on the 2nd of July, 1901. And because he disapproved, he was shot by Hancock. His own guy, really, I suppose you could say.
This was they were sent out on a patrol, weren't they, the 2 of them, and Hancock came back on his own and said, no, we saw some Boers, no, they shot Van Buren, no, I couldn't get them, I couldn't bring his body back.
And that's the really interesting part about that is the story came from an Australian by the name of Robert Cochrane, who was the former Justice of the Peace from Western Australia and went to go and fight in the Boer War. And his letter was what really put paid to these officers, because he was, justice of the peace, so he knew exactly how to outline process, date, time. And his affidavit, if you like, his letter, is what started the whole ball rolling against Morant and co.
And yet he wasn't an officer, was he, Cochrane? He was a private soldier.
Yeah, he was a trooper.
And did the earlier Van Buren accusations, did they come up at all during this trial, or was it not known at this point in time, or at least not displayed to the judges?
I don't think it did come up as a specific part, because, that would have been in itself an interesting point for Beresford, I think, to make, or the producers of the movie. But I'm talking under correction here. I'm sure Martin will know.
I don't. It wasn't mentioned in the film at all, and it's mentioned in the book. But I think it was never, because Hancock and Van Buren went off. In a written report, an officer has reported that they came under fire from Boers. The trooper accompanying him was killed. He was unable to retrieve the body. So actually, it's only sort of hearsay, but they suggested that Morant and Hancock let their troopers know what had actually happened to dissuade, pour encourager les autres, to encourage the others to sort of toe the line.
Yeah, what happened after that is that they would refuse to go on little missions with Hancock or Morant. They would refuse. The other troopers, they would say they would have to go with like witnesses or something, and they became very paranoid, and that's led to.
That's very telling, isn't it?
Exactly. That led really to such bad faith growing. When people start sliding ethically like that, not everyone's going with you. Your own troops become your enemy, and your leaders become your enemy if you can't trust them, because you start seeing them shooting out of hand. People that you spend time in the bush with, doesn't matter they're formerly Boers, they're now fighting with you, and next minute they get popped off. That you can imagine just how terrible the circumstances were for these people, because they're in the middle of nowhere too, as I said to you when we chatted previously. They were in the bush north of Pretoria. It's really a alien landscape, really, really alienating. And I think, as I said to you, I think that led to some of this mental slip that started taking place amongst these soldiers.
And the other thing that I always think is, if they truly believed they were following High Command's orders, be they covert orders or out in the open orders, why would they feel the need to murder Van Hees, who's going off to report them? Because he's going to report them to the High Command, who will probably say, yeah, we'll look into it, go away, and then send them a congratulatory telegram because they're doing what they wanted. If they truly believed they were doing what was expected of them, why would they need to silence someone by murdering him?
I think this led to some of the drama of the court case, because they weren't found guilty of his killing. There was not enough evidence.
There was no evidence, was there?
But if there had been, I think this would be case closed. But that one fact you've just mentioned created this entire dramatic continuation of story through to the 21st century in many ways.
Well, let's get back to the action then and progress to some of the stuff that we've already mentioned. Back in the courtroom, the next prosecution witness is Morant's Dutch translator fellow. He recalls the events of that night to the court. This is Hunt's attack. The translator says correctly that I beg your pardon, this is not Hunt's attack. This is back to the night when they shot Visser. The translator says correctly that Morant said he'd shoot the prisoner himself if the men didn't form a firing squad. The lack of any form of trial for the prisoner comes up, which Bolton then emphasises in the courtroom. Under cross-examination, this translator fellow denies he'd said that he himself would shoot the prisoner that night, and that prisoner was a fellow Dutchman. Thomas tries to get the fellow to admit it was Captain Hunt's orders not to bring back any Boer prisoners, but the translator denies this, and we get the feeling that he'd say anything at this point in time to save his skin. Next, Morant himself is called by the prosecution. He proves to be a stern and testy witness, but he does get to utter the best line of the movie when Lieutenant Commander Denny asks him what rule they were following when he had this Visser prisoner shot. And we've got a bit of a clip of one of the most famous line from the movie.
You were present at the action where Captain Hunt was killed? No. Well, then how do you know he wasn't killed in a fair fight? Because I saw his body. Sometime later, you can't possibly know how Captain Hunt met his death. So you cannot produce any evidence to connect Visser with it. So then, why did you order him to be shot?
It is customary during a war to kill as many of the enemy as possible.
And was your court at the trial of Visser constituted in any way like this? What rule did you shoot him under?
Like this? Oh, no, sir, no, it wasn't quite like this. No, sir, it wasn't quite so handsome. And as for rules, we didn't carry military manuals around with us. We were out on the veldt, fighting the Boer, the way he fought us. I'll tell you what rule we applied, sir. We applied Rule 303. We caught them, and we shot them under Rule 303.
And this line that we've just heard was absolutely spot on. He did say we acted under Rule 303, and the movie does a very good job of showing you a box of ammunition with .303 caliber, so you get the idea that it's the law of the bullet, it's the law of the bush. Joe West and Roger Roper in the final roundup agree that Morant did use that line, and he's a bush poet. He's obviously a real character and very charismatic, and you get the feeling in Edward Woodward's portrayal that the real Morant might have actually quite enjoyed having his moment and having all this attention and being quite dramatic.
Well, certainly the biography that I read of Thomas emphasises that he relished this moment and really had an impact on the judges and this one particular testimony that he gave.
I think there's one fact there that we need to point out that I think doomed Morant on this shooting, is that Visser wasn't shot in the heat of the moment. He was shot the next day. They put him on a horse and kept looking for the Viljoen, the farmhouse Viljoen commando. They failed to find him. Then they turned around and went back to Fort Edward. And on the way back at 11 o'clock the next morning, Morant, in the cold light of day, that's when he had him shot. So I think you've got to say that that's one of the reasons why he was, eventually found guilty. I think had he done that in the heat of the moment, he may have got away with it, in this case in particular. But he was building up a series of systematic executions in his mind as payback for probably PSTD, his time there, who knows. But that has to be said. It was pretty coldly done.
And I don't know that we have stressed this, but Hunt and Breaker Moran were very, very close. They were best buddies, drinking buddies. They got all sorts of shenanigans together. And he clearly would have been very upset at Hunt's death at the hand of the Boers. But as you say, that does not excuse any of this behaviour, not in the heat of the moment, but in the cool light of day, having this unarmed prisoner executed.
No, definitely not. So back to the movie, the prisoners are visited in their cells by Thomas, who says there's no news of support from the new Australian government. He also tells Morant that given his temper, he's the best witness the prosecution have, and he says that tomorrow they'll start to call their own witnesses. The other prisoners get Morant to read a poem he's been working on, and once he does, we hear a pretty good example of the Australian bush poetry that was popular at the time. The next morning, as the trial day is about to commence and the military band strike up, a shot rings out and we see that the Dutch translator who'd just given evidence has been killed. We then go to the courtroom, and the first defence witness is the intelligence officer, Captain Bulala Taylor. Taylor paints a very positive picture of Morant, saying although he's a little hot-headed, the men obeyed him. When asked if Taylor knew of any orders to shoot Boer prisoners, there's a long tense silence before he says there was an understanding to do so rather than an order. And then we get a flashback to a scene with Morant, Hunt and Taylor in the field, where Morant tells Hunt that he's brought some Boer prisoners. Hunt rolls his eyes and says, look, we can barely provide for our own men, let alone a bunch of Boer prisoners. Hunt casually tells Taylor to execute them, which Taylor promptly arranges. Morant questions Hunt, saying he thought the orders were only to execute Boers who were caught wearing British uniform. Hunt simply says, new orders from Kitchener. Lord Hamilton's confirmed it with me himself. No prisoners. The gentleman's war is over. Then we hear the execution shots and we see Taylor using his pistol to finish any Boer survivors. Back in court, Thomas asks if Morant had shot any prisoners previously before Captain Hunt's death, to which Taylor says no. So Thomas says by not shooting prisoners previously, Morant was not following orders, and yet now he's on trial from finally following those very orders. The prosecution objects, saying there were no such thing as orders to shoot prisoners, and if Morant can't produce anything from Kitchener or Hunt, that proves it. Denny says that this line of argument is irrelevant, at which point Major Thomas blows up, saying Hunt would not have just invented such a serious order, clearly implying that Kitchener conveyed these orders to Hunt somehow. Denny ignores Thomas's logic and patronisingly says, "We all admire your zeal in defending your fellow Australians, but wild accusations have no place here." Even though Taylor confirms he's seen such executions before, establishing a pattern if not confirming there were orders to this effect. Thomas's argument is quashed under the two wrongs don't make a right rule, and under cross-examination we learn that Taylor is also about to be court-martialed himself for killing Boer prisoners, and he may therefore have a vested interest in getting Morant off the hook.
That's interesting. I mean,
so the Australian government didn't actually have an involvement, did they?
No, they didn't know about this trial at all at this stage. It was all happening fairly quickly in the era of telegraph communication at best. What about the translator character? I couldn't quite figure out what purpose he was serving, but clearly his giving information and support to the British means that he's on the outer with his own Dutch-speaking people, but then he gets shot for, I assume, by some of the locals for having collaborated with the British. Is that what the movie's trying to tell us?
I think so. I mean, there was a lot of that going on. There had been a number of executions carried out by Jan Smuts, for example, where some of the leadership, the Boer leadership, went to go and try and convert him, and a couple of other generals to talk peace, and they had these emissaries shot, literally executed. So the Boers are doing the same thing to their own people because of the kind of carnage going on the veldt at that stage. But the incident, I'm just very quickly mention the incident you're talking about. Captain Taylor's had been shooting prisoners. I mean, he'd shot 6 Afrikaans men and boys and stole their livestock at Valdezia, for example, and there's the date and specifics there, the 2nd of July, 1901, for example. And Sergeant Oldham, who was, I think, also facing the charges, and 5 troopers, and they're named as Eden, Arnold, Brown, Heath, and Dale, were the ones who were part of the execution squad. So that's what you mentioned, Captain Taylor, under pressure. That's exactly the incident.
Yeah, and this is where we come to this thing that Taylor's court-martial was actually scrubbed because they decided that he wasn't. That's right. He was told he did still hold a commission, although it wasn't active because he was an intelligence officer, not a line officer. And he was told if he resigned his commission, which he promptly did, of course, and hoofed it back to what was then Rhodesia, then they had no grounds to charge him because he'd have to be taken under the civil courts, which couldn't reach him where he was. So Taylor slipped through very effectively as far as himself was concerned. The tension between Thomas and the prisoners, and this is the thing that I think with modern sensitivities, there's an assumption that this is the British being snobby about Australians. I think it's far more regular officers being snobby about irregular officers. They're not one of us. And I don't think that they would have viewed Morant as an Australian, even though that's where he'd come from to be recruited. I mean, he spoke like an English gentleman. He'd been born and raised in England. So, yeah, I'm not sure. But there definitely would have been especially towards someone like Hancock, who said himself, look, I've got absolutely no education. I don't really know what I'm doing as far as being an officer goes. I just follow orders. You could see making him a corporal, but that would have been about his ceiling, I'd imagine.
You're right, and there was another tension. There was another tension which was between the regulars and irregulars, which of course the Bushveld Carbineers were irregular. The regular army did not like all the irregulars, and about literally half of the forces running around the veldt, 240,000, nearly 250,000 at this point of the war, almost half were irregulars of various sorts.
Yeah.
And by irregulars, you mean not professional soldiers?
Correct.
Right?
They were from the colonies, or they were from inside South Africa itself. And they were not professional soldiers, yes. So there was that tension too.
And just to reiterate what you said about Morant, all informed contemporary sources and modern sources all would say that Morant definitely would have considered himself an Englishman and Englishman only, never an Australian.
Yeah. Okay, do you want to take us back to the movie, Andrew?
Sure. So now it's night after that day in court, and we see Whitten having a painful flashback about the jolly send-off he got when he left home for South Africa. Then we see Hancock having his own flashback where he has a fairly brusque farewell that he gave his wife and his small daughter when he came to South Africa. And then Morant has his own flashback to happier times, singing with Hunt and Hunt's entourage, including Breaker's fiancée before a piano player. The next morning, Before the troops and the prisoners rise, we see a line of Boer horsemen slowly march up to the camp. We see a local Boer lady who's having an early morning affair with one of the British soldiers. She sees them approaching and she quickly hoofs it. She looks at the time and realises that the attack that she must have known about is imminent. Her lover, the soldier, is immediately blown up by a Boer grenade or a mortar, and everyone immediately knows that they're under attack at its battle stations. The waiting British soldiers are slaughtered in their underwear. The Boer guerrillas have taken early command of this battle, and we see our 3 prisoners quickly released and armed to help defend the camp. Unsurprisingly, our 3 prisoners take a brave and effective role in the defence of the camp, despite the firepower of the Boers and their dynamite. Our 3 heroes get a machine gun set up at the gate of the camp and mow the Boers and their horses down, effectively saving the day. But this bravery has no impact on the minds of the judges in the court-martial, who state that the prisoners were simply doing their expected duty, despite Thomas quoting the Duke of Wellington to support his arguments. Instead, the trial moves on to the second charge, the execution of the 6 Boer prisoners. So we've had the trial of Visser, now 6 other Boer prisoners. The action jumps back to the timeline of that event, and we see Hancock, Drummond and Taylor relaxed and swapping tales at an outdoor table in the African sun. Suddenly, half a dozen Boers arrive, waving white flags of surrender. The cynical soldiers said the things before, the Boers will shoot when they get a bit closer, or under arrest, under imprisonment, eat some British rations before escaping to fight them again. They round the dishevelled-looking prisoners into a barbed wire pen, while Morant states that they're part of the group that killed Hunt. At this point, Taylor, the intelligence officer, simply says, execute them. Whitten tries to protest, but Taylor is insistent. This is war, not a debutante's ball. There are no rules here, Taylor says. At that point, we see the German minister, Hesse, arrive on a buggy. Morant says Whitten and Hancock are to get a firing squad ready for when the minister leaves. Hancock is not fussed about the proposed executions. He tells us he's just taken some very lethal dum-dum bullets from the Boers that are in the barbed wire pen, further condemning them in Hancock's mind. Morant engages the minister and tells him there is nothing for him to see here, but the minister looks with concern at the Boers that are being held in that barbed wire pen. So we might try and unpack a little bit of that. The flashback scenes, just a little aside, Hancock actually had 3 children waiting back home for him in New South Wales, not just the one, but that's a bit of license we're happy to take.
That's right. I mean, there's a couple of...
What about the attack on the fort?
That apparently did happen. I was wrong. I initially thought it was just part of the hoopla of the movie, but...
Well, look, I am losing a bit of faith in the bias of Greg Groden, who did the Major Thomas biography that I read, because he claims that actually happened. He says that there was an attack, but he's been very sympathetic to both Hancock and Breaker Morant in his book. So he's very detailed about it, but he does say that there was an attack on the fort on January 23rd, 1902. Does that match with the timelines that we're going here? I guess it does. He tells us that the 3 prisoners were released and they were armed, not with a machine gun, but they played a key role in the defence, shooting regular rifles from the fort's roof. And then, as the movie suggests, a few hours later they were back in court. And Groden then says that Thomas should have argued that their bravery can get them off, that there is some military rule, the principle of condonation, where earlier crimes can be pardoned due to later acts of bravery, which we've just seen apparently happen as the movie portrayed. And some later... What do you think about that?
I didn't find anything in the book I read about this attack, but the principle of condonation was explored. Lieutenant Whitten's brother, who we'll get to later on, because he's sentenced to death, just a spoiler alert, but then he's given penal servitude. It's downgraded to penal servitude for life. And now his brother was trying to get him off, and he employed a lawyer called Isaac A. Isaacs, who obviously had very unimaginative parents, who looked into it. But this rule of condonation was originally was a canonical legal principle used in divorce cases, where a husband or wife forgave adultery on the grounds that the spouse was in all other aspects a good spouse, and in the belief that the transgression would not recur. Its military usage was first used by the Duke of Wellington but this was in relation to corporal punishment, not capital crimes to which it had never been applied. So basically it was saying, and it's this thing of, if you've seen the Battle of Waterloo, the movie where Christopher Plummer's Duke of Wellington sees a guy saying, what are you doing with that, a private soldier, what are you doing with that piglet under your arm? This is obviously a looter, for which the penalty was hanging. So I suppose you could say it was a capital crime. And this private says, this little piggy's lost his way home and I'm trying to reunite him with his mother, sir. And the Duke of Wellington laughs and says, this man knows how to defend an indefensible position. Raise him to corporal. Now, I don't know how true that story is, but that's the sort of thing it was aimed for, not murdering prisoners. So I think the whole argument of condemnation is a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, I was just saying the shooting again, you look at the details, and that's why condemnation would not have worked here. If you, in an act of drunken violence, shoot one of your colleagues or stab or whatever, that's where this probably comes into play, in the middle of a war and everyone's dead and you're doing something. But the shooting of that Captain Taylor and Morant ordered of the 4 surrendered Afrikaners on the 23rd of August 1901, there were 4 of the Boer fighters and 4 Dutch school teachers who just happened to be there. And they were captured in hospital. They were all ill. And 3 black witnesses were shot. So Taylor and Morant had these 8 shot, as well as 3 witnesses on the 23rd of August 1901. And that's, I think, part of the incident that you're discussing. That's very hard to condone in any way. Yeah. And there are many witnesses, other witnesses to that incident by the Carbineers' own troopers. So, I think there's a limit to which you can condone, is what I'm saying here.
No act of subsequent bravery can forgive that.
And that's where he's observed the shooting and in complete shock took off. And as we described, down the road towards Petersburg, he and his driver were then done in.
Now, the thing about dum-dum bullets is just worth exploring for a moment. They're basically, it's where you take a bullet and you file a cross into the nose of the bullet, which makes it less accurate, but means that when it impacts with an animal or a person, the shock is enormous. They're banned by the Geneva Convention, which obviously wasn't in place at this stage, but they were banned under most supposedly civilized countries' rules of engagement. And I know that you mentioned in a recent episode, Des, that a Boer admitted that he'd shot someone with a dum-dum and apologised, saying, look, I had 1 magazine for animals for which I'd used the dum-dums and 1 for people, and I got confused.
Precisely. I mean, one of the most famous Boers of the conflict, Des Latham, who survived, and was a really incredible character. He started at the age of 15 or 16 fighting.
Yeah, I've been following Dennis's travels with fascination.
Yes, he's an amazing character. But he admitted in a fight in Magaliesburg, just west of where I am here, he'd been shooting animals, he claims, and then he'd shot, and he literally blew the head off this poor British trooper. And he was in shock because he didn't realize he'd done it. And I do think it was kind of like an honest description. It's kind of, he didn't have to say in his memoirs, I did this. It was going on, yes. And the dum-dums they used actually weren't a cross. They were flat-topped. They were what
they sawed the heads off.
They're called wad cutters. Yes, they sawed the heads off. So they would cause huge injuries by animals that were trying to take down, which would then collapse virtually straight away. So, but they were definitely using them against the British as well. And there's a lot of denial about this, but there's no question about it. We have a biography admitting it.
Sure.
Just finally, Martin, the Isaacs, the lawyer that was engaged by Whitman's brother, he's a famous Sydney lawyer, and he went on to become Australia's first Australian-born Governor-General.
Oh, well, there you go. He still had unimaginative parents. It's like Neville, the father of the footballing Neville brothers. Anyway, just a quick one on Major Bolton, the prosecutor, who in reality only comes into the court action now. But you can understand they had a small budget, minimise the number of actors you have to pay. So I can quite happily forgive that. But Major Bolton's an interesting character because he'd actually gone to prove to be one of the really good guys in the war, rather after it, where he became an administrator of a South African province and very aware that everyone was going to have to, former combatants were going to have to live with each other and alongside each other. He fought very successfully and very hard to get compensation to be paid to Boer families who'd had their farms burned as part of the denial to the commandos of their support network. You know, and he actually ended up being a pretty decent chap.
Yeah, that's the reality here, is that you have these lights and shade in conflict, and most of the forces at war were doing it, if I can say honestly, they were fighting as soldiers. They weren't, they had honorable means and honorable reasons. So there were only a small minority who were looting and raping and pillaging, and on both sides. And the vast majority were fighting honestly. So I can imagine that someone like Bolton would pop up afterwards, because when you go to war with someone, and after the war in many cases you can become friends, as long as you don't have this execution policy at play on both sides, which was not the policy.
And we've discussed many times before. In fact, when we did a pre-call last week and the three of us were chatting, it's very, very rare that you will find soldiers on the front line feeling personal hatred or antagonism towards the other side when they're not actually engaged in, trying not to be killed by the other side. The examples of the First World War and the football match at Christmas Day and all those, there's so many examples of this where, no, he's just doing his job, I'm doing mine. I've got no personal animosity against him. And then you get characters that go over the top, and that's where barbarity is repaid by more barbarity, and it can just escalate, as was could be seen on the Eastern Front in World War II between the Germans and the Russians, and Germans who were then shipped to Normandy to fight the Allies having to be told by their comrades who hadn't fought on the Eastern Front, saying, no, we don't behave like that here, let's keep this civilised, it's in our own interests. So
yeah, precisely.
Fascinating.
Interesting stories from the Boers where all of them, if they had seriously wounded men, they'd leave them for the British to find, to look after. So, there's a real distinct understanding there that while the hot shrapnel was flying around, you would fight, and then directly afterwards, they would literally give each other cigarettes and tea. So that was the culture of this war.
And you can understand the troopers in the Bushveld Carbineers, or many of them, absolutely hating these orders they were being given. And which leads to the letter of complaint that 15 of them wrote and sent to Major Lenihan, who did nothing about it, hence his court-martial, which isn't actually shown in the movie. Back to the movie.
Okay, we see Whitten. He's trying to tell Morant that shoot prisoners that came under a white flag is very, very wrong. But Morant says, you know the order. If they come in under a white flag, then we didn't see it. At which point Whitten says Morant is only doing this to avenge Captain Hunt, and which Morant does not deny. Morant sees that preacher fellow, Heath, and the prisoners, and they've been conversing, and this angers Morant, who confronts the preacher. Next, we see Hancock prepare the firing squad to shoot the prisoner before a derelict farmhouse. Before he gives the order to shoot the prisoners, one of the Boers rushes Whitten and wrestles him to the ground. During the tussle, Whitten shoots the man dead with his revolver. Before Whitten can even process what he's done, we hear the firing squad execute the remaining 5 prisoners. Then we're suddenly back in the courtroom at the start of another trial day, and Thomas announces he plans to determine once and for all that the accused was simply following Kitchener's and Hunt's orders. To make his point, he gives a summons to Lieutenant Colonel Denny, the head of the judges, requiring that Kitchener be called to the trial. Kitchener himself can put the matter to rest, he says. Denny is aghast. Do you really think a man like Kitchener could be responsible for orders of such barbarity, he asks. After a long silence, Thomas says, I don't know, sir. But he then goes on to detail the many other barbarous orders that he himself has carried out in this war. And Thomas then mounts a great and passionate argument for dragging Kitchener before the court. Before we learn that whether he's successful, we see the prosecutor Bolton approach Thomas later that night in his boarding house. Bolton tells Thomas that their trial is getting a little too much interest from the press. Bolton says that Australia's own first Prime Minister now wants the trial hushed up, rather than portray the new nation as a bunch of hot-headed, uncivilised rabble, unworthy of a place in the civilised British Empire. None of this has any impact on Thomas, and then we skip to Lord Kitchener, and who's concerned about the way the trial is headed. Kitchener then bluntly admits that if these 3 Australians need to be sacrificed to bring about a peace with the Boers, then so be it. Small price to pay. Kitchener then completely drops the problem at Hamilton's feet and tells him to go to the trial and deal with the accusations that the Australians were following Kitchener's own orders. So then we see Hamilton being sworn in at the court-martial. Thomas asks if he can recall a conversation with Hunt in Pretoria the previous year. Calmly, Hamilton says he's got no recollection of any such conversation and that he's never spoken to Hunt about his duties in the Northern Transvaal, at which point Morant stands up and yells, "You're a liar." Despite being challenged, he sticks to his line, and then Lieutenant Colonel Denny asks Thomas if this puts to rest the issue of some verbal orders to shoot prisoners is finally out of the way. After a little contemplation, Thomas says, on the contrary, he regards that testimony as having no bearing on the defence. It is instead inadmissible. It doesn't matter whom Hunt says he had the orders from, just that he says he had them, and that's what he told Morant. Several witnesses, including some for the prosecution, has testified that this was what Hunt believed, and that the charges should now be dropped as all men were simply carrying out Hunt's publicly stated orders.
Yeah, well, as we've mentioned, Lieutenant George Whitten faced the same charges but was given a commuted life sentence for cooperating with the prosecution. I do think there's some strength in the argument that Whitten was very much a scapegoat. I mean, I think he'd only arrived in the unit the day before the first group of executions. He was a junior lieutenant. He'd never served in the military before, and he was thrown into this situation with two very strong and older characters in Hancock and Morant. You can kind of really sympathise with Whitten, and he was a little bit thrown to the lions. And like he said, the only person he shot was the Boer who attacked him trying to get his rifle, which I believe is true, that someone did go for it.
Yeah, I think it is.
And he didn't give any orders for anyone to be shot, and in fact tried to moderate Morant's orders by saying to him, it's not really legal. As you mentioned, Des, I think Morant clearly had some form of PTSD, or he was definitely psychologically damaged. He was not the same man that you read accounts of people meeting in Australia.
Yeah, I think Whitten, as you've said, that's correct from what we understand from the limited documentation that exists now about this. But I must also say that Kitchener at the time, from the second quarter of the year, June, July, he'd set in motion an extensive system of drives that started in February, but it really accelerated, where he would partition parts of the countryside and then put his men into it, 5,000-10,000 strong columns, and they would literally scorched earth the veldt. They would take out everything on the veldt. They would kill all the livestock they couldn't cart away. They would take the women and children, throw them in concentration camps. And there was a feeling that this was a tough time. He was also under personal pressure, Kitchener, to end the war as quickly as possible by then. So he's got into a big rush. So what was said off the record, we don't know, do we? But the reality was, on the ground, there was a sudden, stern approach taken by the British. And the second thing was, Kitchener issued a proclamation in August 7th, which told the Boers to surrender by the 15th of September, or all the leaders would be exiled for life, and all their property taken away to pay for their family who are now in camps. So I think that the stern action and the more systematic effect of British on the ground had an effect for everyone involved. There was like a hidden message going on there, which I'm not saying that Kitchener was saying shoot the prisoners, but he was definitely saying make life much more difficult for them.
Yeah, and implied instructions, if he did, and it's certainly, looking at his character, something you could imagine Kitchener saying, goodness me, we've got all these prisoners to look after. It would be much more useful if they were all killed in action, and someone interpreting that and turning that into a perceived instruction. I mean, we're with Henry II and Thomas of Becket, aren't we, with who will rid me of this turbulent priest? Three guys hear him go, right, the king wants us to kill the Archbishop of Canterbury. It's not exactly what he said,
Yeah, and I was thinking going down a different path. It has been said often that the Boer War was a bit of a template for the terrible wars that were to follow in Europe in the 20th century. And, the word concentration camp, that's true that was first coined for this particular conflict.
That's right. I mean, it was called internment camps, and very quickly became known as concentration camps. And in fact, Goebbels, when he was approached by the British in the late 30s before the war and told that they believed that there are these camps set up for Jews, he said, well, you guys designed them first and perfected them. So the last thing you can come here and tell me about is about our camps. We're just using your model.
Yeah, and that concept of...
But it's a bit extreme.
The concept of not writing anything down and just using verbal orders, which is what we're suggesting might have happened here. I mean, that was picked up, as you say, with who were in with this troublesome priest, but it's something that I'm sure the Nazis and the Stalinists, a generation or two later, implied for, don't leave a paper trail, just make it all verbal.
Well, look, I don't want to say that there was a direct correlation between those two kind of camps, because that's not really true. But what happened was that the military ran the camps in South Africa, and they had a military approach, and these were civilians, especially young civilians, little children. So they completely miscalculated what would happen in these camps with cholera, tuberculosis, malaria, even all kinds of diseases swept through the camps, typhoid fever, and it took out 10% of the Boer population basically at that stage.
And of course, around the same time, we had the Americans doing the same thing with the Native Americans on the what they called reservations, but it's a similar principle.
Yes, you're right, and even more interesting, Americans had done this in Cuba. They'd started this camp system. When there was uprising in Cuba, they took the women and children and put them into camps to make the men stop fighting. And that was only a few years before. In fact, the Americans were doing it in the Philippines at the time. There was a war going on in the Philippines where the Americans were involved with, and they were doing the same thing. So it wasn't a start, but that's what the phrase was coined, concentration camp, was the Anglo-Boer War.
Back to the movie. The next day is a Sunday, and there's a prayer service for troops as the prisoners reminisce about Sundays back home. Thomas appears and tells them that the result of all the charges will hinge on the final charge, that of murdering the German missionary Heath. We learn that when the missionary finally left Fort Edward, Hancock followed him later that day with a rifle and comes back with a story about shooting game. The next day, as Thomas is about to enter the courtroom, one of the uniformed men says one of the prosecution's witnesses was very indiscreet at the pub, so he's tipped off about something going on. As the charges are read out, there's a short flashback to Heese, leaning to his left in his buggy. He's already dead, he's been shot. The prosecution call a Corporal Sharp, played by Chris Hayward, who we've seen before but not prominently. He was the sentry on duty the day that Hesse left the camp. We jump to that timeline and we see Sharp say farewell to the Reverend from the fort. He rides off, and then Sharp continues in court saying half an hour later he saw Hancock and Morant discuss something at close quarters before Hancock rides off in the same direction as the missionary with a rifle in his hand. With a little help from Bolton, Sharp paints a very poor picture of Hancock and Morant to the court. And it's my one problem with the portrayals, is this Corporal Sharp is just a pantomime stupid soldier. Yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir. So we then have a cross-examination by Major Thomas, who tells us that Sharp was thrown out of the Carbineers for robbery from the locals around Fort Edward. Thomas also asks if Sharp has been bragging that he'd walked barefoot across South Africa to be part of a firing squad that shot Hancock, to which Sharp stammers that that was just the beer talking. So we now get Breaker Morant himself on the stand, and Bolton asks about Morant's relationship and interactions with the Reverend Heese. Bolton accuses Morant of wanting Heese dead, as it would be in his best interests. Morant says, "I've done nothing wrong, and if you recall Colonel Hall from India, he will confirm this." And this is a new character for us in the movie. And then Hancock takes the stand. Thomas immediately asks for more time to confer with him, which is granted. Alone with Hancock, Thomas says, "Look, come clean with me. If there's additional or mitigating circumstances and I can get this charge dismissed, probably the whole case will fall apart." "All right," says Hancock, but he doesn't want any additional witnesses in court. So the next day, with Hancock on the stand, Bolton asks for his version of events. He then sort of reluctantly says he was out visiting. Colonel Denny, the president of the court, asks, "Visiting what? Who would you be visiting?" And we discover that Hancock's visited 2 local women to make sure they were okay in the absence of their husband. We then get a flashback to one such visit and the next, where the women were very keen to get intimate, as Colonel Denny put it quite delicately. Thomas then presents written depositions from the ladies in question supporting Hancock's story. Dennis, appalled by Hancock's behaviour, who simply says, a slice off a cut loaf is never missed. Thomas points out that Hancock's morality is not on trial, and it seems to have worked, and maybe the heat is off. In the prisoner's yard, Whitten asks Hancock who really did kill the missionary, to which Hancock just looks at him and without hesitation says, "Oh, me." Morant appears and says that Thomas must never know the truth. They mustn't put him in that position. Whitten says it's wrong to lie to Thomas, at which Hancock erupts saying, "We're lying? What about them?" He says everyone knew they were dead the day after they were arrested. Morant says, look, this is a new kind of war for a new century where the enemy don't wear uniforms. Some are women, some are children, and some of them are missionaries. We then get a flashback which details the conversation between Hancock and Morant mentioned by Sharp just before Hancock rides off with his rifle, and it confirms the prosecution's accusation of a conspiracy between the two to murder the missionary. Truth is, we don't really know, in reality, we don't really know what happened to Hess, do we? It's circumstantial evidence.
No, to this day, you're right, we don't really know. But the fact that both he and his black driver were knocked off, and there's no description about
it doesn't look
no,
good.
it doesn't, and there's also no description about what happened to the cart and the horse and the goods, the equipment, because there's a lot of lawlessness going on, as you can imagine. So it's possible bandits took them out, but it's also quite possible that they were taken out by Hancock as.
Well, if I can just add something from the book that I've read by Greg Groden. When Thomas got back to Australia, he campaigned for decades to get some action, a retrial, some retribution, just some light, some attention on the trial. And according to this book, he caught up with Whitten many years later, like 20, 30 years later, and after trying to defend the three of them all these years, according to this book, Whitten told Thomas finally that he knew that Hancock had murdered the minister, and this apparently was quite devastating for Thomas. So they had, according to this book, they kept it from Thomas, as the film suggests, but he did eventually learn many years later that, that Hancock was the murderer of the Reverend.
And also remember, the story had depositions. It wasn't just a court case. They were actually written statements. And you must mention that, the two of the written statements, the one about I would walk 100 miles barefoot to shoot Morant and Hancock, was actually a deposition. It was written. It wasn't a drunken bar conversation. Trooper Sharp wrote that in his deposition. And also Trooper Thompson wrote that he confirmed seeing the orders of the prisoners being shot. And there's a number of depositions like this. As I said earlier, the other troopers were horrified and growing more and more so. So it's not just a matter of the court case here. And I know there's dramatic license, but that has to be said. And I'm interested to hear that what you just said about what Thomas was told, because I wasn't aware of that. But, I'm a journalist as well, and I don't make hearsay fact. At the same time, because it's history, and we're looking at likelihood. The fact that they'd shot 4 Dutch school teachers and 4 Boers in cold blood in hospital, from the hospital dragged them out and shot them, plus 3 black witnesses, is by itself stands alone. The Reverend is just the Reverend, which becomes even more horrifying. But the point is that they would have really gone deep down this rabbit hole of darkness already.
So someone said that about all these recent celebrities with sexual harassment and rapes and all sorts of children and all these ghastly things that have come out largely since Jimmy Savile in the UK. And someone said, a bunch of them are just going to be people who've met them and jumping on the bandwagon. And as someone pointed out, 99% of them could be bandwagon jumpers. If they did it to one person, they deserve to go to prison for the rest of their lives, and it's the same sort of thing. I don't really get the validity of the defence. We'll get to that in the summaries. But I'm sure, and the point I was going to make is, I'm sure there were some of the troopers who were thieves, who were, rustling livestock and selling it for their own profit, who didn't like Hancock and Morant coming along and instilling discipline because it curtailed their activities. But I'm sure that was a minority. The majority of them, the impression you get is that actually they were pretty dedicated, they were quite effective, and they were quite happy to be robust in their approach to the war. But this was something different. Completely different.
Yes, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's very clear evidence of that.
We're back in the courtroom, and while the military band plays outside, Thomas gives his closing summation to the judges, and we've got a bit of a clip of Thomas.
Yeah, and I think this clip is quite revealing.
The main fact of this case, that Boer prisoners were executed, has never been denied by the defence.
And I think the main point there is the thing we've been saying all along. He doesn't deny they say the execution of the prisoners has not been denied by the defence at any stage. And as we've just been saying, that's it, slam dunk, sorry. Whether, we'll come to the thing of the manual of military law shortly, but please do carry on.
Thomas points out that there should be no charges at all against Whitten. He was there as a junior officer, was following orders and only shot a single Boer in self-defence. He paints the Boer commandos as crazed, merciless lunatics, which Kitchener has now chosen to fight with his own rebels, the Bushveld Carbineers. The Bushveld Carbineers have been given carte blanche to defeat the Boers, and with General Headquarters happy to ignore their methods when it suits them, and now suddenly their methods are being described as criminal and murderous. There's nothing barbarous about Morant, Thomas tells us, quite the opposite.
And we got
a bit of a clip.
The fact of the matter is that war changes men's natures. The barbarities of war are seldom committed by abnormal men. The tragedy of war is that these horrors are committed by normal men in abnormal situations. Situations in which the ebb and flow of everyday life have departed and have been replaced by a constant round of fear and anger, blood and death.
And that clip, that's a really good point he makes, as we said earlier, that war creates abnormal situations in which normal people, to all outward appearances, perfectly normal, well-adjusted people can behave in abnormal ways. And it's not about the men, it's about the women, it's about the situation.
Yes. Yeah.
Major Thomas then adds that we should not judge the actions of the soldiers at war by civilian standards. And this seems to have given the judges some pause for thought, in the movie at least. That night, the three prisoners are enjoying a drink and a smoke. They toast the Bushveld Carbineers as the best fighters in a bad cause. Willett asks, what's the bad cause? The Boer War, comes Morant's response. 500,000 men fighting a few thousand farmers. Whitten's myth that his grand adventure is now being called a bad cause. Morant and Hancock are getting drunk and philosophical. Morant quotes Byron and he rants about the glory of Greece and Rome, of battles and freedom. Whitten finally loosens up too and he laughs at Morant's performance. Then Hancock decides to take centre stage and recites a bawdy limerick. Thomas and Taylor both arrive. They've got champagne and they learn that the men have learned that they've been acquitted of the murder of Reverend Heath. Hancock and Thomas are excited that they might get only a light sentence for their other crimes. With their tin cups, they toast freedom and Australia, and horses, and women, all from their tin cups. Taylor takes Morant aside and tells him don't be too certain about that light sentence. Taylor, the intelligence officer, makes a good point. He says he thinks that Taylor himself will be safe for his own trial for killing Boer prisoners, but a simple rough fellow like Hancock won't get the protection of Kitchener's office or any of the other higher-ups. Taylor then offers to break Morant out and help him escape and disappear into the night. The weary Morant declines and we see Taylor depart.
Yeah, they were acquitted of the murder of Reverend Heath, mainly due to lack of evidence, and we can't say whether Hancock really did or not, but the balance of probability, I think if it was in a civil damages court where it's not, proof beyond all reasonable doubt, but the balance of probability, I think you'd say he probably did. But they did celebrate it and appear to have thought that, well, that's the worst one out of the way, the killing of the civilian. No one's going to be bothered about us shooting some Boers.
I just trying to remember the alibi that they came up with, that he was with two different women that afternoon. I think that's true, isn't it? They did actually have some written depositions read into the court that said that day was spent with these two women by Hancock. That's right, isn't it, Des?
Yeah, that's right. Whether or not the woman that really happened, we're always speculating on speculation, but the point is that they did have supporters. It wasn't just this group by themselves, and they had a huge amount of sympathy from both the officers that were involved in this case, by the way, and the general army. But I must tell you that the civilians, English civilians living in South Africa at the time, there was the Dr. K who kept a diary. He actually monitored the case And it's one of the few examples of documentation we have separate because, as you know, both the military tribunal, which we're getting to, and the court documents disappeared. But the tribunal was actually destroyed. But the doctor said he was following it, and he was completely beside himself with fury that his own people, so to speak, had been conducting themselves like this.
I think it's also worth saying, just to snuff out any conspiracy theories in their growth, that the fact that the court records have disappeared or were destroyed, all court-martial records up till I think something like 1909 were stored, and I can't remember if it was a fire or damp, but they were basically, the British Army have no court-martial records extant between, I think, 1851 and 1909 or something. So it's not that this case, mysteriously, it's not the empty folder syndrome you see in crime dramas or something.
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right.
So the next morning, Lieutenant Whitten is escorted to see Lieutenant Colonel Denny on his own. Denny informs a shocked Willett that he's been found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, but due to the intervention of Lord Kitchener, he won't be shot. Instead, he will serve life in prison. Still reeling, Whitten returns to his cell. Next, it's Morant's turn, and Denny informs him that he's been found guilty of murder and has been sentenced to death. A very stoic Breaker Morant seems to accept this, and he's escorted back to his cell. As he passes Whitten's cell, he matter-of-factly says, "Shot tomorrow morning." Next, of course, it's Hancock's turn, and he's to suffer the same fate as Morant. In the next scene, we see Thomas arrive at Kitchener's HQ, and he wants to see Kitchener. Colonel Hamilton appears and tells him there's nothing that can be done. Thomas informs Hamilton 2 of the judges also recommended the same leniency that was shown Willett. Thomas enters Kitchener's office anyway, only to find it empty, and he's told that Kitchener is on duty out on the veldt somewhere. Thomas says that he wants a stay of execution so he can telegram the King and the Australian Prime Minister about the verdict. He's told that the British and Australian governments support the verdict. Forget it, Major. It's a sideshow of the war. Thomas looks like he's finally been beaten. Coincidentally, he hears that there are talks of a peace conference with the Boers. Then back at the prison, we see carpenters making 2 coffins within earshot of Morant and Hancock. Hancock, with tears in his eyes, writes his final letter to his wife, and then we see Morant write his final poem by candlelight. Lieutenant Whitten is being escorted out of the prison in handcuffs, but he runs towards Breaker's cell and cries, "Why have they done this to us? Why have they done it?" And Morant says, "They're doing this as an apology to the Boers for this damn war. We're scapegoats," Morant yells, "scapegoats for a bloody empire." As Whitten's taken away, he sees the firing squad getting ready to do their duty in the dawn's light. Major Thomas appears one last time, but Morant tells him, "Don't feel too bad. I've had a good run," and he's trying to be philosophical about his fate. He hands Thomas some letters to send on his behalf, as well as his final poem, and he says, "Please get it published. We poets do seek immortality." He then joins Hancock to be escorted to the execution, and there's a lovely pithy little clip which we don't actually have, but Morant is asked if he wants the prayers of a pastor. He says, "No, thank you, I'm a pagan." Hancock turns to him and goes, "What's a pagan?" And he says, "It's just someone who doesn't believe there's a divine being dispensing justice to mankind." So Hancock turns to the priest and says, "Yeah, I'm a pagan too." Morant does ask if he can have an epitaph, Matthew 10:36. And his final words are, "Well, Peter, this is what comes from empire building." Thomas asks the shunned pastor about 10:36, Major Thomas this is, and the response comes, "And a man's foe shall be of his own household," which is obviously Breaker knows his Bible. The condemned hold hands as they approach 2 chairs on the edge of a ridge, and they take their seats facing the firing squad. They decline the blindfolds offered. As the sun rises and the firing squad prepare to shoot, we hear Edward Woodward as Breaker Morant narrate his final poem, Butchered to Make a Dutchman's Holiday, which is quite a pithy and amusing telling of how he's got to be in this situation. And then his final words, "Shoot straight, you bastards, don't make a mess of it." The volley of the bullets ring out, and for an instant we see the reactions of Whitten, Thomas and Taylor. The firing squad stand their ground as a buggy arrives with the coffins for the 2 bodies, and then we hear Breaker Morant singing Soldiers of the Queen, which we saw in an earlier flashback to happier times. We then learn in text form that Thomas returned to his law practice in the countryside of New South Wales, Taylor remained in South Africa after the war in a senior administrative position, so he clearly wasn't found guilty of killing Boer prisoners. And Whitten served 3 years in a British prison before being released, returned to Australia, and eventually writing a book, Scapegoat to the Empire. We then see the bodies placed in their coffins as Morant's song about the glories of England's empire reaches its crescendo. Roll credits. And incidentally, right at the end of the show, we will play Edward Woodward reading the final poem by Breaker Morant, and you'll hear the firing squad preparing and his calling out to them. And then Edward Woodward, who turns out is a heck of a good singer, singing Soldiers of the Queen, and that will be our outro. So do stay with us for that, because it's not Alfred Tennyson poetry or William Wordsworth. It's pithy. It's what you call a soldier's poem, you know.
Yep.
Wrapping all that up.
They did get. Look, that last scene. It's all very moving, and a lot of it is kind of right, but they did take some dramatic license, and I suppose it's a minor matter, but the sentencing order's not quite right. Morant learned of his sentence first, and then Hancock and finally Whitten. But the dialogue and all the reactions would probably be pretty correct. You know, the shock and all being learned that they're all going to die. As far as we know, Thomas never got anywhere near Kitchener. Nobody challenged. He had to travel great distances, wouldn't he, have to go on to get to Kitchener's headquarters so quickly to try and lodge a complaint.
Yeah, Kitchener wasn't there at the time, but he actually was aware of this trial, and he had been approached, and he was the one who ordered that Whitten be not be executed for whatever reason he had. But he was aware of it at that point. But the problem we're talking about February 1902, not November 1901, which is there were two court cases. Well, there was a court case and then there was a court-martial. So that's conflated a little. But the point, that Kitchener was aware and he refused to commute the sentences, except for Whitten's.
And that slightly chilling scene about the coffins being made in front of the men, that apparently is true. They got to witness their own coffins being made in front of them before the firing squad.
I think that was part of the punishment at the time, if I remember. Okay. That was the symbolic... Because it's all taking place in very small confines, really. If you look at the size of these actual venues, these buildings and so on, they wouldn't have done it far away from where they were incarcerated. So I don't think it was necessarily malicious. I think it was just part of the structure there, yeah.
I believe they were shot in a courtyard within the prison or the barracks buildings. They weren't taken out onto the veldt. But there was a brief mention made of a Colonel Hall, who the defendant seemed to think his testimony would be vital, because he apparently was the one who passed on the order to Captain Hunt, saying, take no prisoners. And again, we have this distinction. There's a difference between take no prisoners and any prisoners you take, wait a couple of days and then shoot them. You know, there's very, very clear definition between those two interpretations. But there's been this big conspiracy thing that Colonel Hall was whisked out of the country and sent off to India. He wasn't at all. He was posted. He finished his tour of duty in South Africa, and his position as liaison from General Kitchener's headquarters to whichever area he was responsible for was taken over by another officer, and Colonel Hall was just quite normally posted, and he went off to India to command, I think, an artillery brigade or something. So... yeah, there's an awful lot of that people sort of grasp onto. Interesting little bit that you dug out here, Andrew, of that Major Thomas had actually met Breaker in Sydney years before.
They were. I think it must have been under the rubric of the Bush Poets Convention or something similar. He had met him, and I don't think he pointed that out to him. And Breaker Morant didn't really remember it, but. The less famous poet, Thomas, he definitely remembered it. And Thomas came back to Australia and got very interested in Aboriginal society around his town of Tenterfield, and it caused him to reach out to another early anthropologist of Indigenous people in Australia, one Daisy Bates. And it turns out that Daisy Bates had been Breaker Morant's first wife. He lied about his age and said that he was 21 when he was 19, and he married Daisy Bates. She later became Daisy Bates, and that marriage fell apart almost immediately because Breaker Morant refused to pay for the proceedings of the wedding.
That's right.
So many years later, decades later, Thomas ends up befriending, having correspondence with Breaker Morant's first wife. How's that for serendipity of some sort?
It's a small world.
Indeed.
The don't shoot straight, you bastards. According to the book I read, that line first appeared in a novel called Breaker Morant that came out in the 1980s, I think, probably after the film, trying to build on its popularity. And they think what he actually said was, "Make sure you do a good job, lads." Or he did say something to the firing squad along the lines of, don't mess this up, make it clean, make it quick, whatever. But yeah, or Des, you've read somewhere that he said, "Don't miss, you bastards," or something like that.
No. I think you're 100% correct. It was mythologized, the statement, but I'm not entirely sure exactly what he said.
And interesting, he described himself as a pagan, not an atheist. Now, to me, a pagan is someone who believes in, a pantheon of gods, or maybe pre-Christian
traditional British
gods.
ancient Celtic religion. But he did say he was a pagan. And he did say he didn't want the last rites from a priest.
And they did decline blindfolds, didn't they? You see, if I'd been Breaker Morant, I'd have said to the firing squad, "Do us a favour, lads, could you aim about 2 feet over my head?" But, yeah. Okay, I'm being flippant.
And the bit about the one survivor that, got released after Lytton after 3 years in prison, that's all quite true. And he did go home to Australia, and he did write a book titled Scapegoats of the Empire, published in 1910, and it did get some attention at the time, and periodically this issue of this great injustice by the evil British military does come up in Australian popular culture. It came up around not long after the Gallipoli campaign, where Australians were to some degree thought they were being used as cannon fodder by the British generals. It came up, of course, again when this movie was released in 1980, this image that Hancock and Morant were rough but honest men punished by the British military who were only chasing other imperial ambitions. It does come up definitely in Australian popular culture every now and again.
I do think they were, to a degree, sacrificial lambs. They were scapegoated. I do think that it was easy for the establishment, for the military establishment to do it because they were irregulars. They were from a country thousands and thousands of miles away from Britain, where anyone making complaint, if they'd shot 3 members of the Devon and Dorset Regiment, their families would only have to travel 150 miles and they're knocking on the door of the War Ministry in London. So I think there is definitely an element, they probably were, held up as sacrifices so that the British command could say to the Boers, with whom at this stage, and Des will know this much better than Andrew or I, they were trying to come to some kind of peace agreement. And they were saying, look, we I know you don't like some of the stuff we're doing, but we don't like some of the stuff you're doing, but we are upholding our civilised standards. Look, we've executed 2 officers and sent one to prison for life for atrocities committed. There probably is
to some extent, I think there is, but there's something else I must say, is that men had been executed by the British, their own men, consistently throughout the war for various crimes. So firstly, that was happening constantly. Secondly, Morant and Hancock's story wasn't really well known at the time because a lot was censored. So it wasn't necessarily being used by the British at the time. But it's become a narrative post the war. The Times, for instance, really covered the case at the end of the court-martial. They didn't really cover the initial case, which was pretty much censored, as I said, by the authorities in Pretoria here, the British authorities. So I think it's built up after the war, ironically, this whole story, because at the time they were just officers who were shot for doing the wrong things.
Yeah.
It's become the symbol now, but at the time, I strongly wanted to mention this, that the Boers were shooting Boers and the British were shooting British. It was a done thing. If you turncoat from the Boers, they would shoot you, and their own people. And the British would shoot their own people. They were lashing their own soldiers who were getting drunk and fornicating with the local black population, for example. They would tie them to wagon wheels and lash them with the cat o' nine tails version, or what we call a sjambok, which is made out of rhino hide, till they bled. It was discipline in a different era. So we must say that.
I think that was field punishment number 1. was the spread eagle across the wagon wheel and lashed. Yeah.
And if you're really unlucky, they would roll the wagon.
Oh, yeah.
So they would do it while the wagon was rolling, they would lash you.
But I think my point is, whilst some of the feelings of, they've been used as political pawns is true, it doesn't detract from the fact that they were guilty of murder. And one of the documentaries I watched about and we'll come on to it shortly, this James Uncle character in Uncles in Australia is a military lawyer who's trying to get a pardon from the British government. Now, he claimed he'd found documentary evidence, and we're going to play a clip. In fact, let's play that clip now. We'll just play the news clip.
Morant and Hancock had always said they were acting under orders by shooting Boer prisoners. Now a new document has emerged from the British archives confirming their story. And Australians working to secure a pardon for the men say this could be the evidence needed to clear their names. Tried and convicted Harry Breaker Morant and Peter Hancock were executed by the British in 1902, touching off our most enduring military controversy. The new documents confirm that orders to kill Boer prisoners were given by British officers Captain Percy Hunt and Captain Alfred Taylor. The federal government won't intervene, saying it's up to the British to examine the evidence, but the British refused to budge.
So the opening words there you hear is Lieutenants Hancock and Morant always said they were acting under orders, and this new document backs their story up. No, it doesn't, because I've done as much digging as I possibly can without visiting the Parliamentary Transcripts Library. The only thing that James Uncles reveals is he's found a transcript from 1901 where the Parliament or a parliamentary committee debated the existence of a no prisoners order and requested a legal opinion on whether, if one did exist, whether it would be valid. That is not evidence that Hunt and that Morant and Hancock were given orders. Plus, in the Manual of Military Law, which existed at the time, you were not only allowed but required to disobey a command that you knew to be unlawful. And there were soldiers in the Bushveld Carbineers who refused to shoot prisoners, and all it led to was a rolling of the eyes, and the officer would then go and shoot them with a revolver, or another man would be put in. And there were a couple of near mutinies from them going, no, we're not doing this. The only one who they seemed to have executed was Van Buren, because his crime was not only refusing, but threatening to report them. And that's when Hancock took him out on patrol and he never came back. The character of Harry Breaker Morant is fascinating. He definitely was a colourful character. He was adored by some, despised by others. An easy man to build a legend around, but he also did a fair bit of myth-making himself. There's a lovely line from fellow Aussie poet, well, he's Scottish, I believe, Will Ogilvie. He said of him, Breaker was a man who would do anything for a friend and generous to a fault. If he had any money, it was yours as well as his. And, as he seldom had any, yours was his if he could get it. So he was obviously a bit of a, fly by the seat of his pants kind of guy. He owed money all over Australia, didn't he, Andrew?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. He was definitely a bit of a vagabond and a cad, and he deliberately lied. He impersonated, as you say, the son of an admiral, and to get a free hotel, try and get hotel bills paid in London and stuff like that. He was probably more of a nasty character than an honourable character, from what I can see.
Well, the DVD I watched, there's an interview with Edward Woodward at the end, and he absolutely loved being part of the movie. He said it's one of the most rewarding projects he's ever been part of. And he says, he's asked about the character of Breaker Morant. He said, I think I've played him quite sympathetically. He said, it's not my job to interpret. It's the director tells me what he wants, and that's my job is to provide it. He said, I think he was probably a bit more rough and ready than we show. And certainly, you get that impression.
Probably should wrap it up, shouldn't we, and give some scores, and it's a long episode as it is. What do you think? Anything else you want to say?
No, I mean, I think it resonates to this day. 2010, the Queen was asked to pardon him. She said no. I mean, she didn't say no. She handed on to the Foreign Service, and they said no. And the military said no. And in 2010, a group of Australians approached and said, can we pardon them here? And the family of Viljoen, the farmer, said no. So this goes on and on, doesn't it? I mean, in 2002, there was a commemoration over the graves. A large group of Australians arrived here at the graves. In the late 90s, the Australian government refurbished the graves. So we go on.
The documentary I saw with Australians and relatives present in the Australian Parliament when an MP brought it up, and this James Uncle's character and a Scottish Australian author also, they're all giving their part, and then they interviewed some of the South African descendants of the murdered Boers. They were saying no matter what you think about the politics of the time and whether one guy said, you're trying to say that it was an unconstitutionally assembled court and they weren't given all their rights. He said, that's getting a murderer off on a technicality. He said, my ancestors were murdered by these men and they're guilty. Whether the correct procedures were followed or not is kind of irrelevant.
And they haven't forgotten. The family there literally haven't forgotten. So, it's 118 whatever years ago, and here we are, 117 years ago.
If I was going to take up the cause of someone wrongly convicted in the past, I don't think these two would be anywhere near the top of my list.
It's a great story, though.
But,
great movie.
Great story, good point. Great movie. So I give it, I don't know, 8 or 9 out of 10. What about you guys for entertainment?
I think 9 out of 10. It was absolutely
I'm
transfixed.
biased, but 9. Yeah, 9, definitely.
I think just from a cinematographical, is that a word? It is now, sense, when you do these timeline jumps, they can be really disorientating and confusing, and I think it deals with them so well. It's really clear that the court introduces a incident or a period of time or an event, then you see it. Then you get the court again, then you see it. It's so well done. I mean, hats off to Bruce Beresford. He's done a fantastic job. Really has.
I agree. There's no cheesy swirls of xylophones, ring, ring, back in time. It's
and
brilliant.
I was going to say that, it was on a shoestring budget, but there's no music whatsoever, right? There's nothing to sort of convey any emotions to you. It's purely the scenes, the long silences, the good acting, and the narrative progression, as you said, jumping back and forth. It's very.
That's a really good point, actually. The only music you hear is the music they would have heard because it's a band in the background, and often it's incongruous. The first supplementary episode we did way back at the beginning was music in the movies and how films use music to guide our emotions, to give us information, and actually, well noticed, Andrew. I hadn't actually picked up on that there was no incidental music.
So yeah, well done, Bruce Beresford, as you say. And as far as history goes, I think your average Australian, probably including me, would have said that it was quite historically accurate. Given it a 9 or 10, voting from the heart. But I know now, having done the research with you guys, that they've been pretty fast and loose with the truth. They've admitted some terrible atrocities when it suits them to distill it down to just a couple of charges, which, as you say, are pretty horrific when you stop and think about it, that they're not just not taking prisoners, they're taking prisoners, holding them for a bit, and then callously, consciously executing them. And even the film kind of portrays that, just compresses the time a little bit. They do it on the spot instead of the next day. So.
And you don't see them shooting clear civilians and children, which they did. And yet I think there's an awful lot of as we said earlier, you watch a film like this and you can interpret a movie like this to reinforce whatever your beliefs were before, be it these were virtually innocent men just doing their best in difficult circumstances, to know they were murderers and they deserved everything they got. So again, I think Beresford's done a brilliant job of keeping it morally ambiguous.
Yeah, and from the long arc of history, the long arc of history, which is what Bruce Beresford wanted to achieve, that war is a terrible business and makes normal men do abnormal, horrific things, it's a 10 out of 10, if that's the history you're trying to tell. But no, this is trying to tell the history of what happened in 1901 and 1902 in Transvaal.
And it's so difficult because Edward Woodward plays Breaker Morant in such a likeable way. You do like him. You understand the pain at the loss of his friend, but he shows that he doesn't have the moral framework within which to isolate that, grieve for him, but still behave in the way that an officer or anyone in command of troops needs to. Yeah, I don't know. It's difficult. 7?
The history?
7, 8?
Yeah, I think I'll go 7. And it's much less than I would have done.
I don't think it could be lower than 7.
Yeah.
I don't think it could be lower than 7. And it's mainly for the omissions, not the commissions. It's the bits it's left out. It's like it's told the truth and nothing but the truth. It just hasn't told the whole truth.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but I also think that it's one of the more accurate movies I've seen historically, even though we've been critical, because we know a lot about it, we've read a lot about it, but if you look at the actual effect of what Beresford was doing, I think it was pretty accurate. He was also, for me, symbolically painting not just a picture of war there, but this war in itself, about the various people's reactions, and doing it, I thought, with an incredible accuracy in terms of emotion, trapping people's emotions and understanding that.
Well, coming from you, Des.
That's what resonates to this day.
Coming from you, that's high praise, I think, Des.
Yes, I remember when it came out, there was a lot of arguments. I was in the army at the time, and we all believed it was a very, very accurate depiction of what took place in that war. Both the Afrikaans people fighting with me, as well as the English, because of course we were in the same units then. So, but there was a big debate, and everyone agreed it's pretty accurate.
Maybe 7 pushing an 8, but well, in summary, I mean, if anyone hasn't seen it, it's not the easiest film to track down. It's not on Netflix. I had to order a DVD, which was available on Amazon.co.uk. I will try and add some links for people in, particularly in Australia, South Africa, America, and Britain, for your various Amazon outlets. Outlets. Thank you. Are probably the best thing to chase down. If you do get a chance, do watch it. It's just so well done. It doesn't feel low budget, even though it clearly was. I absolutely, wholeheartedly and thoroughly recommend Des's podcast. It's fascinating, the impact it had, the tropes that it set for 20th century warfare, and also the human condition incidents that happen, which you can go back to the Trojan War and see the same things going on, and it's done in such an entertaining way. You manage to talk about very deep subjects in a light-hearted way, but never flippant, and I think it's absolute credit to you. And I hope when you finish that one, maybe you'll consider doing another one, maybe the Zulu Wars, or
I've been thinking about that.
Speaking of which, we have discussed with Des the possibility of covering Zulu Dawn, which is it's a prequel, although it was released 15 years after Zulu. I think 79 it came out, about Isandlwana and the events of the days leading up to Rorke's Drift. And on Rotten Tomatoes, it gets absolutely panned by both critics and audiences. It's down in the 60s, which I find astounding, so I'm going to have to rewatch it. But we'd be very interested to know, would people like us to cover Zulu Dawn? I think it's a movie with far more depth of topic and conversation than Zulu alone. And Des, we'd love you to come back on if we decide to do that. Probably be early in the new year, possibly around the time of the anniversary of the Battle of Isandlwana. But you know that area, don't you? You can bring such a depth to it that if you've enjoyed this experience, you don't mind giving up another.
Well, I'd love to. I mean, I'm so honoured and so thankful of you phoning me and contacting me and us doing this. And Martin, Andrew, I really respect you. I've been listening to your podcast too, and the way in which you combine the idea of the truth with history and how Hollywood and movies has done it, I think is extraordinary. So thank you so much. I'd love to come back and do Zulu Dawn.
Brilliant. That's a date.
I guess we're kind of wrapping it up then. Remind me, Martin, what have we got next out of the box?
So coming up in 2 weeks' time is 13 Days, Cold War thriller starring Kevin Costner. Not the best known of films, I wasn't aware of it, but we'll be covering that. And 2 weeks after that, we'll be doing Reversal of Fortune, which has actually become even more topical because one of the protagonists, Klaus von Bülow, New York socialite, accused of murdering his wife. He's played by Glenn Close. He's played by Jeremy Irons in the movie. He died early this year. And for that episode, we will be welcoming back our good friend and the host of the Second Decade podcast, Sean Munger. So we are guest happy at the moment, and it's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and we'll speak to you again in 2 weeks. Most of you by then, hopefully, will have finished this month. I think this is going to be our record-breaking episode.
Could be.
But for me, it's been so worthwhile.
Yeah, thank you for your time, Des. Thanks, Martin, and I look forward to the next one.
Thanks, guys.
And we're going out now with Breaker Morant's final poem, and then a little song sung by the late, great Edward Woodward.
The nights are a trifle chilly, and the stars are very bright. A heavy dew is falling, but the tent is rigged all right. You may rest your bones till morning, then if you chance to wake, give me a call about the time that daylight starts to break. It really ain't the place nor time to reel off rhyming diction, but yet we'll write a final rhyme while waiting crucifixion. For we bequeath a parting tip of sound advice for such men who come across in transport ships to polish off the Dutchmen. If you encounter any Boers, you really must not loot 'em. And if you wish to leave these shores, for pity's sake, don't shoot 'em. Let's toss a bumper down our throat before we pass to heaven, and toast the trim-set petticoat we leave behind in Devon.
Aye! Shoot straight, you bastards! Don't make a mess of it!
So when we say that England's master, remember who has made her so. It's the soldiers of her queen, my lads, who've been, my lads, who've seen, my lads, in the fight for England's glory, lads, of its worldwide glory let us sing. And when we say we've always won, and when they ask us how it's done, we'll proudly point to every one of England's soldiers.